There were a few incidents where the forward scouts had been wounded by their own men because he'd taken a turn. Nobody knew that he was going to be over there. Somebody'd see something move and fire at it.
What was the longest that you were out for?
Nearly 3 months. One poor fellow was out going about his business, and we had a contact, and he came back in without his trousers, and so we had to retrieve his trousers. He didn't know what to believe, and they actually sent home a telegram saying he'd been mortally wounded to his parents, which I found dreadful. There were 2 occasions where we actually walked it in right onto our perimeter, and the shells landed 30 metres from us. The lieutenant and I were running almost together, and he said, "There's something wrong with this, Frank." And I said, what is it, sir? And he said, "We're running towards the gunfire." He just loved artillery. and every night from then on, we just walk it in until we heard the shrapnel going through the trees and leave it there.
Frank, thank you very much for being involved in the archive project. The first thing I want to ask you to do is give a very brief summary of your life, starting from where you were born and then take us up to now.
Right, well, I was born here in Cowra, and I've lived here all my life. I've been away 2 or 3 times on trips, but basically Cowra's been my home all the time. So I went to school in Cowra. I went to school in a 1-teacher school with 20 pupils when I was in primary school, and then I came to the high school and went into a class of 46, which was a bit of a shock. I completed high school. I was too young for high school. I was a year before I should have been. I was only 16 when I did my leaving certificate. And then I went to work on the family farm, which was a dairy farm. And that was going to be my life. I was going to be a farmer. I applied for different jobs around town and wasn't particularly interested in them. I liked the open air life and the outdoors, and so Dad just took me on as with my brother as farm workers. This was in 1964, and then in 1965, 66, when National Service started, we didn't try to do anything else. We thought we've got to wait until the National Service thing is out of the way and then go on with our lives. So it sort of put a bit of a stop to whatever we were going to do. And then I got called up, went to Wagga and went through the army training, went to Vietnam, came home, married a local girl and moved to Canoundra. And we had 2 children, lived over there until 1988, and then we sold the farm and broke up. I remarried and moved back to Cowra, and I've been here ever since. Since then that relationship's broken up, and so now I'm here. And this with my partner Kerry. And that's about where I'm at. We run a bed and breakfast. I became a builder after the army, and I've been building ever since.
What did your father do in World War II?
He joined the artillery, and then he joined the ambulance. And he was 3 years in the army in Australia, and he was quite far north in Australia due to go to New Guinea when somebody found out that he was a dairy farmer and milk production had dropped, and he was manpowered back out, which he was reasonably happy about at the time. He'd done 3 years in the army, and they were on their way to New Guinea, and he came back to the dairy farm. He was always a bit put out that he'd done so much time in the army and then couldn't join the Returned Soldiers League. That hurt him a bit. He always thought that was a bit unfair that's the way it happened.
Do you remember what you had to do to register?
Yes, we had to register. We had to, I think we got a form, probably from the post office, I can't remember exactly. We had to register, and then we got a registration card that showed that we'd registered. That was the thing they used to burn to show that they weren't going to register. Had we known how little the government really knew about all of us, probably would have been a lot more not register, because we had to initiate it, as far as I can remember. And then you got your registration card, and then you waited for the ballot. And I just can't remember whether they published the dates that had been selected, or we got a notification. Then we got a note. We just definitely got a notification that we'd been selected. I can remember that coming. And then we were told to present ourselves for a medical, and then if we passed the medical, we were given orders then to report to a certain spot, which was Wagga for me, and yeah, that was probably about 6 months time frame, I think, for that.
Had you thought about joining the Army as a side from National Service? Had that ever crossed your mind during that time?
No. I think it was a good... I think it was... I used it myself, I feel, as saying, well, they've done this to me, I've got to go. You know, hip hip hooray sort of thing. And I used the experience. Going away was a good experience. Going into the Army was good. It broadened my horizons, and you know, it was an outlet. I still think that. I sometimes think what my life would have been like if I hadn't have gone into the Army. And if I'm depressed, I think, oh, my life would have been better without it. But then I think of the experiences I've had because of it, and I think, well, my life mightn't have been better. And I think on balance, my life has probably been a lot different, maybe not better, but a lot different because of my experience in the Army. It certainly gave me confidence. I've had people remark only recently that I changed from being a very timid little boy into a confident person. So if it was that alone, it was probably good.
Just going back to that time when you're waiting, what did you feel when you saw that your birthday had been selected, or heard that it had been?
Well, one of excitement and one of anxiety, both at the same time. Just, I'm on my way. Yeah, just a very mixed emotion of wanting to stay at home and wanting to go. Yeah, and having all the interplays of people saying, "Oh, you're going into the Army, good on you, mate," and then my cousins at the same age. One of them said, "Oh, great, you're going into the Army." I said, "Oh, gee, I wouldn't like to do that." There wasn't a universal "good on you, you're going," which I think was the thing in the Second World War. Anybody that went into the Army in the Second War, into the forces in the Second War, was, "We've got to get this job done, good on you." There wasn't that. There was right from the start, there was a division. And of course I had my father was dead against it. So he was negative. Mum was negative. So I think it was very hard. There was only a few people that were positively for it. The younger generation were for it because it looked exciting, especially if they'd missed out. So there was that. There was a division straight away. So we went off with a division in our minds.
What did you know in '68, given that the war had been going for 5 years, what did you know about the war and what was happening at that time?
I can remember the reports of the Battle of Long Tan on the radio and in the press, and that was in '67, and that was just prior to me registering. So there was, yes, we were getting quite a bit of reports of what was going on. I think we had a pretty good idea, although we still seemed quite removed from it, even though we were facing getting called up.
Why do you think you were removed from it?
Oh, just the innocence of youth. Because you weren't all going. All my friends and relatives around the place were just going on with their lives normally. So you were doing what they were doing. You're going out on Saturday nights, going fishing, swimming, doing all the youth things, driving our vehicles, shooting, whatever. We just went on with life as it was, and although you had in the back of your mind this is going to change, they didn't. It wasn't going to affect them one way or the other once they missed out. So they just went on with their lives. And I think we were in that. So you didn't give it, you gave it a sort of a, oh yes, I'm going into the army or Vietnam's there, but I don't think we thought much further than that.
You said that you experienced some feelings of excitement when you were called up. What were you excited about, do you think?
Oh, being like Dad. Being like my grandfather. Being like all the people I'd heard about through my childhood, about, you know, it was the progression of growing up. They all went to war, they all came home, they married and lived happily ever after. I think I had that feeling. I thought, oh, gee, you know, I'm going to go into the army. I'm going to come home, just like Dad, just like my grandfather, just like my uncles. And I think it was a real buzz that I was going to be like them. And it was a disappointment probably that they didn't see it that way. But I certainly did. I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to be like them. I'm going to be a man just like them. And my life was sort of getting an order to it that was similar to what they did.
How much did you think when you were first drafted about getting killed?
Oh, we had so many friends getting killed here in motor cars that I don't think we thought about it. You know, youthful enthusiasm. I think some men think about getting killed a lot. I don't think I did. I couldn't imagine myself getting killed, so that might sound funny, but there were fellows in the units in Vietnam that could imagine their own demise. And once they started to imagine that, they were very worried. I had a friend there that he only slept when I was on guard. And I said to him, why? And that was for an hour and a half a night. He says, because you're the only one I can trust not to go to sleep, because I know you. He was really scared that I think he could imagine his own demise. Whereas I don't think I ever had that problem. My imagination saw every possible wound, but not death. And I think a lot of fellows are like that. Mind you, fear came, you know, you were scared, but you just somehow were going to survive.
So what did you do on that first day?
In Wagga, we were just inducted, given fairly old uniforms and all our kit that we needed for that training period, and virtually told to get it into order. We didn't know what order it had to be in, and they said it was going to be a dress parade in the morning. So I spent most of the night sewing buttons on this old uniform because it just didn't have any buttons on it. And I always remember that. I couldn't believe that we were going to go on parade and I had to sew all these buttons on. And when we went on parade, we all got into trouble for not being properly dressed anyhow. So, but trouble was the second word down there. We were in trouble all the time because that was the way we were treated for the first 6 weeks at least. Didn't matter what you did, it was probably always wrong and you got yelled at.
What do you think that was about?
To make a mob of unruly civilians into a unit. I've talked to officers since, and that was the whole design, was that everybody there was worse than the unit, and once they got the people sticking up for each other in the unit, then they were winning. So they would pick out somebody and abuse him. And if he stood there and took the abuse and nobody supported him, they hadn't got to the point where the other men were. It was us against them, and that was the idea, to get the unit, our little platoon, saying, we're the platoon, they're them. And it worked. It was great psychology. Finally if somebody got picked on in the unit, the whole unit said, oh, wait a minute, you can't do that to one of our fellows. And that was a change. We were working as a unit. That's what they wanted.
Who was doing the picking on?
Oh, from the platoon commander down. They used to take it in turns. Who was going to be the bad corporal or bad sergeant for the next week? And he'd just pick on the unit. Yeah. They took it in turns. It was quite deliberate, I think, until they got us a unit, and it was brilliant. You know, that's how it worked. And then after the first 6 weeks of training, things eased up. They started to become human again, and you could relate to them, and they talked to you, and yeah, it was a different thing for the next 6 weeks.
So what sort of exercises and training were you doing in the first 6 weeks?
We did physical education every day, probably 2 sessions a day. We did rifle training, drill till it came out our ears. Then we had lectures at night. We used to get up at 5:30 in the mornings. Usually weren't in bed by 9 o'clock at night. And then you had to be presentable the next morning. So all the maintenance of your gear and your uniform and everything had to take place between 9 o'clock at night and 5:30 in the morning. So there's many a time you'd be still going at midnight, getting gear ready. And then they had room inspections most days. And if anything was out of order, you got into strife for that. Yeah. The first 6 weeks were pretty horrible, but we survived it.
What was the accommodation like?
Oh, brilliant. 4 men to a room, brick buildings. They just rebuilt the Wagga camp when we came in. Up until then, they were in 1945 tin huts, and then they rebuilt this camp, and it was just almost motel accommodation. You know, they were good rooms. They were 4 to a room, and then the ablution blocks were at the end with heaps of showers and toilets. But they were good accommodation. You couldn't complain about that.
So what did you do in terms of training after that first 6 weeks?
Well, the second 6 weeks was just similar until we marched out of Wagga. Then we got our postings, which was to our corps. And I selected artillery, and the camp was at Wagga. It was at North Head in Sydney, the artillery school of artillery. We went there, and we were there 3 months, and we trained on radios and basic surveying techniques, radio transmission, aerials, all the things to do with radio, because we were going to become either command post operators or forward observer operators. And that's what we did there for 3 months. Then we went to Holsworthy and just continued that sort of training with a bit of infantry training as well. Then we went to Enoggera in Queensland and joined the unit there, and it was going to Vietnam. So, in the meantime, we'd gone to Canungra and done our course at Canungra. That was 3 weeks. And then we went to Enoggera and joined the unit. And it was just then the training didn't affect us so much. It was unit training where they went out with the battalion and trained on field exercises and moving troops and, yes, everything on a bigger scale. And by the end of that, we were ready to go to Vietnam.
Just going back to Wagga for a moment, what were the options in terms of, choosing your corps?
I can remember the lieutenant came in one day and he said, the army is a very democratic place. We give you choices of where you're going to go. Gentlemen, you have 4 choices. So long as it's a fighting arm, you'll get it. We all thought that was pretty nice. So we had a choice. We had armour, artillery, infantry or engineers. And so long as we picked one of those corps, we got it. So that was our choice.
Were there more popular corps?
Oh, everybody wanted to be a driver somewhere. That was fairly popular. I don't think so. I got artillery because my father was in artillery, and I put that down on my selection, and it was automatic almost. They wanted you to carry on the tradition sort of thing. Yeah.
So how did you get to North Head from Wagga?
We came down by train. Overnight train from Wagga to Central, and then they bussed us over to North Head. Yeah.
And can you describe what the camp was like up there?
North Head is just a magnificent building. It's I think it'd be heritage, and it was just magnificent. I thought, what's the army doing in this place? Just old sandstone buildings. All the fittings were brass because we had to polish them. All the door handles, all the window latches. Just a lovely place. It was, if you had to be in the army and be in a camp, it was probably the best place you could be. Every morning you got up and walked to your window and looked down the harbour to the city. It was just a beautiful place to be. Away from the city, but in it. Mm.
So what did they teach you about artillery and what your role was going to be?
I was straight away selected to go as a radio operator, and so we just did radio communications and all associated with that. Worked with battery operated sets and different radio antennas, and yes, we just learnt all of the things about radio, which is a funny thing because we did Morse code, and not that we ever got proficient with Morse code, but we had to know it. What else did we do? Oh, different radio procedures were needed because you had set procedures for different things. They all had to be known. Yeah.
Can you explain in as much detail as you can how the radio operator works with the artillery?
There was a command post, which was the centre of the battery, where all the orders were generated for the battery to act. We were forward observers, which went out with the company. We would radio to the battery what fire we required, and there was a procedure for doing that. There was fire mission initiated. It would come into the battery. The battery would then get our coordinates, what rounds we needed, when, how, whatever the procedure was, and that was relayed to the guns, and then they'd fire. That was our initial job when we were in Vietnam.
How far back would the artillery be?
The gun range for us was about 14 kilometres, so they could be anywhere, wherever we were operating within that 14 kilometres. Sometimes, if our guns weren't in range, we'd use American guns, which might have a range of 20 miles or 30 kilometres.
Can you describe what those guns were and what they were like?
The Australian guns were 4-inch 105s. They fired a projectile about so big, excuse me, and it'd go up to 14 kilometres. It got a bit dangerous if you were at the end of the trajectory because they weren't that accurate. The American guns were 6-inch guns, which fired a projectile so big, and it would go 30 kilometres. We used to be within, say, 300 or 400 metres of the impact rounds when we fired missions. We would fire a mission with one gun. We'd radio back that we wanted fire on a certain target. One gun would fire a shell. Where it landed, we would then adjust. We would say right, left, back, or up, so many metres, and they would adjust it. And we'd see where that one landed, then we would fire the whole battery onto that target. So sometimes you would adjust them in fairly close, depending on the situation you're in.
So what are the circumstances by which artillery would be used in support of infantry?
Well, if we were on patrol and there was a contact with the enemy, initially my orders were to contact the battery straight away and say contact. And so they would get my call sign, contact, and then I'd just say wait out. And that went straight back to the battery. The battery then would look up our last known position and swing the guns to that direction. So they were already basically in position. They knew our last position, they were aimed in that general direction. Then we would give a grid reference, usually plus 1,000 metres, just as a safety thing. And we'd ask for one gun to fire, and it would fire on that position. As soon as that round went over, and we knew it was at least 500 metres away, we'd just say, drop 500. And sometimes we'd go straight to the whole battery firing, depending on whether the enemy were withdrawing or attacking or whatever. And then you would adjust that. After that initial shell, 6 shells landed, you might say 3 rounds fire for effect on that, and all the guns would fire 3 rounds. So you got actually 18 rounds on the target. And if it was too far away, you'd drop it. So you might say drop 100, and they'd walk it in towards you.
How do you stop yourself getting hit by artillery fire?
Oh, usually it wasn't. You used to walk it in until you heard the shrapnel going through the trees. But we were always on the ground, and so we never thought about it hitting us, because most of the stuff we heard going through the trees was well above us. And that's when you knew that it was getting close enough to do the enemy damage. There were 2 occasions where we actually walked it in right onto our perimeter, and the shells landed 30 metres from us. And the same thing applied. We were on the ground, lying down usually, and the shrapnel would just go through the trees.
Can you give me an idea of what sort of impact those shells have on a target?
Well, if they landed on the ground, they'd blow a crater about 1 metre across and probably half a metre deep. But the shrapnel would go up to 500 metres. If they hit a tree, this was where it was very dangerous for our troops, because if they hit a tree above you, the shrapnel would come down in a cone, and that's when you used to get our own troops wounded. from artillery fire. There was one incident where a New Zealand battery had killed some Australians. It was mainly because of a tree. It didn't have much to do with the aim of the shell. It hit a tree right up high. That was the most dangerous.
So what equipment would you need to carry on you?
I carried basically infantry equipment and a radio, a 25 set they called it, weighed 25 pounds. 3 days rations, 3 days water, 200 rounds of ammunition, probably my codes, bedding. When we loaded up with 3 days or 4 days rations, we weighed about 100 pounds extra. That's what we were carrying. I carried a camera as well. I threw away some of my rations. I thought there's got to be something out here to take a photo of occasionally.
What did you learn at Canungra?
I don't think we learnt much more than we already had been taught. We just refined it to the specifics of Vietnam. They showed us different things that we'd find in Vietnam, booby traps and mines and the things were specific to that war, and to be aware of what could go on, yes. Canungra prepared us for explosions and live fire, live grenade practice, and we had one place where we had to assault a target, and we had to go down lanes, and each side of the lanes there were explosives in the ground to simulate shell fire or mines or whatever, to get you used to the sounds of things, and a machine gun firing live rounds beside us and things like that. So it just sort of, you really actually felt things were getting a little bit serious, and it was a bit more full on than any of the other training. It was fairly serious training.
Who was training you at Canungra?
There was a Canungra company that were just training all the time, and yes, they put us through our paces. So they were there all the time and just training different units that came in. You came through as units or you came through as individuals, just depending on what part of the army you were in.
Had they already been to Vietnam?
A lot of them had been overseas, yes. They knew what they were talking about. This wasn't airy-fairy. This was experience talking, yeah.
So what did they tell you to expect of Vietnam in terms of the conditions for the artillery?
I don't recollect they told us anything specifically about for artillery. Just, yeah, conditions would be like this, you know, wet in the wet season, mud, dry, dust. They took us to rainforest areas to simulate actual Vietnam conditions, and we did exercises into this sort of stuff, patrols and camping out and all that sort of thing that we did in that part of the world.
How difficult were the conditions?
Well, we'd gone from the lovely accommodation of Wagga to under tents. We were all in tents. And when we went out on patrols, there we were under just a hoochie, just a plastic sheet. So we were living rougher and rougher and rougher. And I often think of that. We declined all the way through our training. Things got a little bit progressively worse. But when we went to Vietnam, that's how it was. Things were pretty rough. We were under tents in Vietnam, and when we were out in the field, well, we were just on a ground sheet and with a hoochie.
Were there particular conditions of the jungle that made artillery difficult?
Yes. One was our communications. lots of times you couldn't just pick up the handset and call the artillery, you couldn't get through. The foliage was just so thick. We had to put up aerials above or as high up into the trees as we could. So that was an exercise in itself. You had to throw something up into the canopy, retrieve it, then pull the aerial up. So there were difficulties that way. And then for no reason why, sometimes if you just laid the aerial on the ground, you got better communications than if it was up in a tree. There were lots of vagaries of the radio waves. So that was a problem to get to the artillery from our point of view. I can't say what the battery's conditions were like because I never was there. I was with the infantry company, and that's who we stayed with.
So your role would be to communicate from the infantry back to the artillery.
Yes, that was my first and foremost role. So whenever we had a contact, if I was with the lieutenant or with the bombardier, our first initial reaction was to call the battery, tell them we were in contact, and we immediately went to cover to work out where we were and what to do. And usually the platoon commander would just turn to the artillery and say, I want artillery here. And that was his initial order. So the contact might have been going on and we were part of it, but we were apart from it because we had to do our job, which was a little bit frustrating sometimes because the action would be going on and you were out of it. But mind you usually couldn't see more than 20 metres in any direction. So the contact could be over there at the head of the platoon and you 20 metres from it and not see any of it.
How were you protected yourself personally if you were doing the radio communications between the infantry and the artillery in terms of enemy fire? How were you armed?
Oh, I had an M16. I could have had an SLR, but they said because we were carrying a radio and extra batteries and we were heavier than most of the other fellows, they gave us a lighter rifle. And they considered the M16 lighter, which it was, and we carried less ammunition because of that. So our weight came down a bit.
So in a contact situation when the enemy is firing, how would you be relaying information back? Would it be a matter of protecting yourself first and then...
Found the biggest tree we could and got behind it. Your initial inner contact, you just all lay on the ground. The platoon commander would then issue his orders or whatever the contact required, and yes, we just took cover and started our fire orders. We had one incident where we were attacked at the front of the platoon and we were spread out quite a distance through the jungle, and we were all running towards the contact because that's what you had to do. You had to get into some sort of organisation. We were spread out over probably 200 or 300 metres, and all of a sudden we had to get up to the action at the front. And we were all running along this track, and the lieutenant and I were running almost together, and he said, "There's something wrong with this, Frank." And I said, "What is it, sir?" And he said, "We're running towards the gunfire," which we had a bit of a laugh about. It seemed a bit silly to be running towards the gunfire. So that was in one contact. Another contact, we were putting up an aerial in the trees, and we were standing in about 4 inches of mud. And in the conversation, I just said to the lieutenant, I said, "You know, we're going to sleep in this tonight." And he said, yes. He said, "Looks pretty crook, doesn't it?" I said, "Yeah, just think, lying in this all night." Anyhow, we were attacked at that point, and there was some gunfire, and immediately we were on our faces in this mud. And I remember looking at him and he said, "Comfortable down here, and it's..." He said, "Yes, lovely mud, this stuff." It did change the situation. The mud looked very friendly when we were down in it. Some of the contacts were like that. They were a bit funny. One poor fellow was out going about his business, and we had a contact, and he came back in without his trousers, and so we had to retrieve his trousers. So he got ribbed a long time for that, leaving his trousers behind. We reckon it was a gauge of how scared he got. He jumped right out of them.
So at Canungra, what information were you given then about the enemy, the Vietnamese enemy?
Well, we were given their units, what they were like, what their we were pretty well briefed on their armour, their armaments, their rifles, all their techniques. Yes, and they used to go through the techniques and show you how they'd initiate an ambush, and we would go through counter-ambush details, and we were pretty well trained up there on all those aspects.
What were their techniques for an ambush as told to you?
Well, as told to us, it depended on how strong they were. If they were in strength, in platoon strength, they would let the forward scout and 2 or 3 of the platoon go through so they would hit the platoon headquarters, and that was what was told to us. We were told a lot of things there that didn't quite fit what actually happened to us. The war was developing in different techniques, I suppose. I can't really remember, can't really comment. I just know that we were told all these things at Canungra. You know, if there's a contact, you'll do this. And I can always remember that the initial thing when there was a contact was you all got on the ground. It was then you did those other things, but the initial thing was get down, and everybody did that. It was just automatic. You just went on the ground. So our training for all the things we were trained at Canungra, the initial thing in action was that you got down on the ground, then you went through your sequences of the training you'd been taught. But there was so many combinations of things that used to happen. Like one day the patrol, the forward scout contacted the enemy. Well, that was 50 metres ahead of us. And at the same time, the tail end Charlie contacted the enemy. So we got enemy signals came down from both ends of the platoon. And, you know, what do you do then? Which was a rare occurrence, but it happened. So the platoon actually split. There were fellows going back that way to help tail end Charlie, and there was fellows going that way. So the poor old platoon commander all of a sudden had a fight going on at both ends of his platoon, which was very difficult. But they were just contacts of one enemy that just fired a few rounds and then got away. So it was just for a few minutes, things were pretty chaotic.
What were you told or trained in terms of guerrilla warfare and that kind of enemy that's scattered like it was in Vietnam?
I don't, in the artillery, I don't think we were specifically trained anything like that. We're just told about it. And the infantry were trained a bit better than us because we were in the artillery. I don't remember. We were probably told more about it when we were in Vietnam. It was just automatic in Vietnam, and yes, we were told more about it then. We were told about their techniques, but it's a bit hard to remember what we were told here and what we were told there. Like a week in Vietnam taught you more than 2 or 3 months in Australia, because you knew it wasn't real here. As soon as you got over there, it was real.
What did you feel was the general mood in Australia towards the Vietnam War at that time? Was it possible to gauge it?
Oh, we gauged it because we were encouraged not to wear our uniforms on leave, not to go out in Sydney in uniform, which I thought was a bit poor in a way, because we were made to feel proud of our uniform in the units and in the army, but when you went out, you sort of weren't to express it. I think that was a bad thing.
What was your feeling towards the fact that you were told not to wear the uniform on leave?
Well, we did it because we just pointed out that, you know, if you run into some of the hostile protesters, you might get belted. So for your own protection, you didn't wear it. And because you weren't told, you know, to wear your uniform, you just went in civilian clothes. Yeah, it was a bit, it didn't really matter to us.
You mentioned that when you first went to Enoggera, the unit had then gone to Canunga for training. Could you explain what the feeling was, the emotion was, when you were all together as a cohesive unit for the first time?
You felt very strong. I think you felt part of a body of men that had a mission. It was a very uplifting thing. You were a unit. Everybody in the unit was relying on your little bit, and you were relying on everybody else. I think it was a good feeling. It'd be like being in a football final, I would think. Any unit that was cohesive was a good feeling. Yeah, I think we felt that. And when we went to Vietnam and became forward observers, that little unit was a good feeling too. So much so that after 6 months in Vietnam, we were asked if we wanted to go back to the battery. But because we felt we were an important little unit, we all decided we'd stay together. So we could have got out of where we were and gone back to a safer position, but we all stayed in that unit.
So what was the training that you did at Enoggera?
Oh, we didn't do a lot until we went on the exercises. Enoggera was just sort of marking time. When we went on exercises up to Rockhampton, they set it out as integrating with the infantry and armour and all the different units. The artillery then became an integration of a bigger unit. And that was, I think, more the training that they did on those exercises were more command and control than basic training for soldiers. We were just part of it, and the training was really moving units and how each unit affected the other. And that, I don't think it was really for us as training. It just got us used to the idea of big things, which was pretty exciting stuff. You know, you had the Air Force coming in with their helicopters and picking us up, and everything was big. You were part of a big show. It just got you used to that.
How did your family feel about you leaving for Vietnam?
I think my brothers and sisters probably were a little bit excited about it. Dad and Mum were anxious about it. Dad was still of the opinion I wouldn't go. I don't know where he got that, whether that was just to help him cope with it. And we had a farewell here, and everybody came to the airport to see me off. Yeah. It was a funny farewell. We got sent home on pre-embarkation leave, and so you were on your last leave, and so you were going around saying goodbye to people. And I went over to say goodbye to a neighbour that was a Second World War veteran, and I always remember this because he was ploughing a paddock and it had to be ploughed, and I walked across the ploughed paddock to him and he stopped. And it's the first time he treated me like a man. He was an older man, of course. And he sat on the plough and he said, now listen to this. And he just told me all the things about his experience in the Second World War in North Africa. And he just told me how to look after myself from one man to another. He was passing on all the things that he thought might help me in Vietnam. I always thought that was a great thing, that he took all that time, because we were there probably 2.5 hours, sitting on his plough. And he was doing the talking, and he told me things that his own family wouldn't have known about war and what could happen. And, yeah, but Mum and Dad and the rest of the family just, probably a combination of anxiety and pride and excitement. You know, the whole thing was a pretty sort of hurly-burly.
Can you remember what some of the advice was that your neighbour gave?
He told me never to be. He said something like, how can I put it? Not keep your head down. That's the thing. You know, keep your head down. Yeah. Sort of never go off your guard. He said, always keep your wits about you. Men died when they relaxed. That's what he told me. You know, don't drop your guard. If you think you're secure, think about it and do something different. Or that was what he told me. And I don't know I can't remember why he told me that or what his experience was. But he said that when men relaxed, they got killed. So I thought that was from a veteran, and I thought, well, it's pretty important. So I think by and large I did that. I didn't relax very much.
Sitting on that plough talking to the neighbour in Cowra about his wartime experience, did it seem real to you that you were going?
Oh yes, it was pretty real then. I think it started to seem real when we were warned for overseas service. Yes, and not to go at that stage would have been, you would have lost the whole goal of everything. Everything was directed that way. So we were quite prepared, and it was starting to seem fairly real, although it seemed a lot realer when we landed in Saigon. I must tell you, we flew out of Brisbane in a 707. All our guns and ammunition and rifles and everything were all in our baggage, and we were just in our uniforms. So we didn't go off to war packed with all our gear. It was all in the belly of the plane. But when we arrived in Saigon, I can remember they just put it all out on the ground, all our boxes and all our gear and everything. And I can still see the battery sergeant major coming around with 2 plastic buckets full of bullets and just putting them down and telling everybody, bring your magazines over here for your rifles. Everybody threw their magazines, and we were just loading live rounds into our magazines in the airport. And then he said, right, here's your rifles, and we all drew our rifles. And he said, right, put one of those magazines on your rifle. And I can remember putting the magazine on, thinking, this is the first time I've had a live round on my rifle in a civilian area.
What were your first impressions of Saigon?
Oh, it stunk. And filth. Just, wow. That was, initial impression was, oh, what's that smell? And just to see rubbish around, it just surprised me. And just once we got, well, we didn't go outside the airport, but it was pretty dirty there, we thought. We didn't go into Saigon. We just then flew straight to Nui Dat.
So what did that make you think in
We
terms
thought,
of...
oh my God, we've got this humidity for the next year in Vietnam. Yes, it was just so hot and humid. And we thought, oh, it's going to be like this. Because we'd been in Queensland, but nothing compared to what the humidity was in Singapore.
What was that? Was that the first time that you've been on a plane?
Oh, no, I'd flown before. Probably the first time on a big plane, 707.
So how did you get from Saigon to Nui Dat?
In a Hercules. We took off we just loaded our gear, we had lunch in Saigon and loaded our gear on the plane and onto a Hercules and flew to Nui Dat.
Given that you were 20 years old, or 21, and you hadn't been overseas, and you've described that you were putting live rounds into your weapons and you're in this stinky Asian culture, how surreal did it seem?
That seemed very unreal. The loading of our rifles was the thing that really everybody sort of went, ooh, you know, this is serious stuff. I think that was surreal. We couldn't believe until we got on the Hercules, and then we were back in the ordinary things that we'd been experiencing in the army. We'd been in Hercules and helicopters and everything, and we were back in the Hercules. We felt like it was real again, but on that tarmac, I think we felt that it was a very funny feeling. Once we got back into the Hercules, we were back in the system. And we were off to Nui Dat. And when we landed at Nui Dat, same thing. We were in an army base. The experience at Saigon was, completely different. I think that's why I remember it. It was just so different to be loading your rifle with civilians walking around.
So when you were on that flight on that Hercules going from Saigon to Nui Dat, were you able to look out and see what the landscape was like?
Oh yes, we looked out on the Mekong River and the Delta and mangrove swamps. But the first 10 minutes we were all rolling down to the back of the aircraft. There were no seats in it. It was just a bare deck of aircraft, and across them they had belts. And they said, now, all sit down and put the belt over your knees. So we all put our belt, it was probably 5 or 6 of us in a row, and all up the plane. And when the plane took off, he went up like that. And all these belts were across our middles, and we all fell backwards. And so the blokes turned upside down. So everybody on the plane did a backflip, and we're all hanging on these belts and thinking, this is ridiculous. Why don't they put something in here? And there's like, of course, as soon as you started to fall back, you grabbed the fella in front of you and grabbed on his shirt, and everybody just... So the first 10 minutes were just chaos as everybody tried to get themselves back in the right place. It was the most stupid thing. We all imagined ourselves rolling out the back of the aircraft. These blessed belts. And our gear was thrown around because the chap did what they called a tactical takeoff. He just went off the end of the runway and straight up. But when we got organised, yes, we could look out on the landscape. But we were pretty used to flying over bush up in Queensland, so it didn't look that much different. Just the rivers were bigger and more mangrove swamps probably.
And where did you actually land?
We landed at Nui Dat on what they called Luscombe Field. I don't know who called it Luscombe, but anyhow. And then we immediately went by truck around to our artillery base, and unloaded our gear there, and I was there all of half an hour, and they said, right, all the FO parties will go to their companies, and that's what we did. We were driven then back to 4 battalions lines, and we went into D Company 4 Battalion.
So were you actually assigned to that company on that day?
Yeah, they just assigned us then and there. They just put us in the battery lines, and then they just assigned whatever companies were going, or whatever FO parties were going to whichever companies.
So what sort of a reception did you get once you joined the company?
Oh, good. They were happy to see us because they were very artillery orientated. They liked the artillery to help them. So we just joined, and we were introduced to a couple of the men. There was no one in our tent. The FO tent was separate, and some of the other tents were empty because that lot had come back to Australia already. But the main body of 4 Battalion was still there. So we were introduced to some of the sergeants and corporals, and that was it. And that was about just on dark that day. And about 7 o'clock, one of the lieutenants came across from the officers' lines into our tent and just said, I need 2 radio operators and a corporal for tomorrow's patrol. And we all sort of looked at him blankly and said, what do you mean? We've got a fortnight to get ready to go on patrol. He said, no. He said, I've got a patrol tomorrow. And he said, I want artillery support. And he said, 3 of you fellas are coming with me. Get ready. And then our lieutenant, our forward observer, came in and he said, right, he said, you and you and you, go down to the Q store, draw ammunition, draw 3 days' rations, and pack it all up and get ready. You're going out 7 o'clock in the morning. So that's what we did for the next 2 hours. We just put everything in our packs and got ready. And they handed me an M16 rifle and said, you won't need your SLR, you have this. And I said, but I don't even know how to use that. I haven't seen one before. And he said, oh, well, you do this. He said, did you see that? And I said, yes. He said, well, that's what you do. Yeah. So I had a lesson on an M16 in about 5 minutes, and I was on my way. So next morning, we went to the helicopter pad and flew out into the jungle.
How did you sleep that night?
Like a baby, because we were completely knackered from everything the previous day. Well, we'd had the flight from Brisbane to Saigon, which was pretty sleepless, and then we've flown out from Saigon, and all we'd just been going since we left Brisbane. So yeah, we slept fairly well.
How prepared did you feel? Because you mentioned that you were assuming that there was going to be 2 weeks, and here you were going out on patrol the next day. What was that like?
I think I was surprised that we'd done it so normally, but we got out on patrol, and our initial thought was we were watching every footprint that we were making because of landmines. We were told, look out for mines, and so we were just green. But the platoon we were with, we'd been there for 12 months, and they were just different men altogether. We just couldn't believe, I couldn't believe how callous they seemed to be, and how nothing mattered. they just walked along and didn't watch where they were putting their feet, and we were all sort of. We soon lost that. He said, don't worry about the mines. He said, you won't see them anyhow. First thing you know about it is when you get blown up. So they were just sort of very fatalistic about the whole thing. And we set an ambush about 10 o'clock that morning on this track, and I can still remember the lieutenant saying to me, you get over there with that rifleman behind that tree, and then he said the machine gun, he said, you get up there, the machine gun, and he set the ambush up. And he said, now I'm going to get down there behind that tree, and when this person comes up the track, he said, I'll challenge him. And then he turned to the machine gunner and he said, if he does anything other than put his hands up, he said, you shoot him. And I thought, oh, this is murderous, you know. That's what my initial thing was. And the machine gunner said, right. Set his machine gun up, looking down the track. And because it was a civilian that was coming, they thought it was a civilian. They didn't know. And he shouldn't have been where he was anyhow. And the lieutenant was just going to challenge him. And so he said, if he does anything else but put his hands up, shoot him. And that was a fairly brutal initiation, I thought.
Did that seem harsh?
Oh, it seemed dreadful. I thought, this is dreadful. That's what it was. And that day he didn't appear, so we set the ambush for probably half a day, and then we moved on to another spot about mid-afternoon and set another ambush. And the next morning, a Vietnamese came walking across the paddock, and the machine gunner shot him. And because it was before curfew. Curfew was from 7 till 7, and this was about 6:30 in the morning. And machine gunner just went and knocked him down. And then turned to his mate and said, gee, did you see how he went down? And we thought, ooh. But that's how it was, and that was our initiation. And anyhow, they brought the Vietnamese in. He wasn't dead, but he had 2 bullets through his thigh and 1 through his shoulder. And the machine gunner said, gee, that wasn't very good. He said, I fired 4 bullets, I missed with 1. And we thought, yeah, righto. So they were very professional soldiers. They'd been there a year. They just treated it, that was their job. And we were just green. We'd just been there 2 days. We just couldn't believe what was happening.
Before we go on and talk about like how you set up the ambush, I just want to go back to that morning when you went out on your first patrol and just try and get an idea of what that was like. Can you walk me through that from when you woke up, going out on that first patrol, exactly what you did and what you saw?
Well, we first went down to the helicopter pad and got on helicopters, which was different to being here in Australia because we were going out into an active zone, so we were fairly tensed up about it. The other fellows we were with were the 4th Battalion fellows were quite laid back about it, although they were probably more tensed up about it because they knew this was their last patrol. They were going home. They were probably tensed up about it from that point of view. I don't think there was any fear or trepidation or more excitement just being in this place, and we didn't know, so we were, now ignorance is bliss, whereas the other fellows probably was fear. They were on their last patrol. When we landed, we were so unprepared we still had underwear on. We still had singlets and underpants, which none of the other fellows wore because it was too hot. But when we landed, it was reasonably cool. It was just at dawn. It wasn't cold, but it certainly wasn't hot and humid. But by midday, I was suffering heat stroke. And when the medic undid my shirt, he said, "Oh, great!" He said, "He's still got his singlet on. Get rid of that." And I said, "What about my underpants?" He said, "Get rid of them too." You know, so they just went. They're still there. We just didn't realise how hot and humid it was going to get. Funny little things. And then after we'd set the ambush and we were going off to set this next one, we were moving fairly fast and my nose started to bleed. So I'm covered in blood because I can't stop my nose from bleeding. And the lieutenant looked around and he said, "Christ, what's happened to you?" I said, "All right." Yeah, that was part of the heat. And that was in the first day or day and a half that happened to me.
What were you told about what that first operation would be, that first patrol?
We were just told that it was an extended 4-day patrol, and it was almost out of gun range. They were patrolling up and down a river stream, up and down a stream. There were Viet Cong in the area, and they expected to run into a bunker system, and they were looking for food caches along the stream. And it was just an extended patrol. And we would be out for 4 days, that was all we were told, because they didn't have much more time to tell us. We were at extreme range of our guns, and to be careful. The lieutenant was told to be careful with the accuracy of the guns, and off we went.
So what did you have to do on that particular patrol as the forward observer?
Oh, just my job, just radio. Oh, well, we found out that the platoon commander just loved artillery, and because of our training back in Australia with all the safety margins that were on live firing, we'd never had artillery near us. And I can remember relaying the orders for the firing, some defensive fire at night, and he walked it in and he said, "Come with me," and we walked to the edge of this clearing, and he just kept on relaying orders to me, drop 100, drop 100, and we could hear the shells in the jungle off, 500 or 600 metres out. And I can remember the first shell we saw was at the end of this clearing, and it was about 300 metres away. And he said, "Oh, drop it another 100." And so we dropped it another 100 and it landed about halfway down the clearing. And he said, "Oh, drop it another 100. He said, we'll put it just out there." And here we are with this artillery going. And he said, "Oh, that's close enough." When the shrapnel started to go through the trees, he said, "I like to hear the shrapnel going through the trees." He said, "I know it's close enough then." And that was my first experience. We just couldn't believe that we had this artillery 100 yards from us. And this fellow liked it that way. It was nice and comforting. It was just out there. He knew where it was. So if anything happened during the night, he'd just fire that there and it was there. Very close.
So what was the artillery designed to do on that patrol in that area where the Viet Cong were?
Oh, just defend our perimeter. Wherever we were, we had it as a backup if we ran into a big, or just into any Viet Cong or North Vietnamese, just as a defensive fire and a backup. We called the artillery. These men had learnt that the artillery was the best way to get the enemy to disperse. And I think that's why initially we always had it. He just liked to have the artillery close at hand. And even at lunchtime, he'd just turn to the FO and say, "Put a shell out on grid reference such and such." So we'd fire one gun and just register it as a target. And he knew that was where the shell was, and it was all ready. He knew that the battery was only a minute away if he needed it. He just loved artillery. And every night from then on, we just walk it in until we heard the shrapnel going through the trees and leave it there. And that was then registered as, the technique was that was then registered back on the guns as a target, and you gave it a target number. And if anything happened during the night, they had all the coordinates registered. And so all you had to do was call up and say, "Fire on target ABC," or whatever the number was. And they just swung the guns onto those coordinates and fired. They didn't have to calculate it, and everything else was calculated. So they just knew that the guns could go straight onto that target, and you could have shells on that target within probably a minute.
How far were you from the enemy bunkers?
Oh. What, when you had a contact or... we used to go into them and camp in them sometimes and set up claymore mines and the machine gun post looking out from their position. We always went into their bunkers. We'd search their bunkers and destroyed them if we could. Sometimes we'd search them and then move out a couple of 100 metres and get the artillery to destroy them if there was nobody in them. We always destroyed them so that they didn't have a bunker system to come back to.
What did they look like?
Well, they were about 10 feet square, probably 6 feet deep, with dirt and logs 2 feet deep on top, and 2 entrances, one in one side and one out the other side. That was a typical bunker, and it could withstand a direct hit from one of our shells. If it landed right on top, it wouldn't go through. They were thick enough, they were probably that thick.
And can you describe, like, once you get inside, what they look like inside?
Well, I just dug out of the earth, just mud, just dirt, with the logs over the top, and only a small entrance hole, probably just big enough to get yourself in and out of reasonably easy. But they were just a square hole in the ground with a roof over the top.
And
Very effective.
How would you know that someone wasn't in the bunker?
You didn't. Well, mostly if they were deserted, there was just nobody there. If there was somebody there, you had a contact before you got there. And they would fire from this hole, so that they were down at ground level, and that's how they used to ambush us. If you ran into a very active bunker system, they fought very hard. It wasn't a good thing to run into a bunker system, because they used to have them designed on the ground that you never just had one bunker. If you hit one bunker, you could bet that there was another one over there to the left and another one to the right, and they would fire that way at you. And that was they had their systems, their bunkers were designed so that whichever way you came into them, there was 2 bunkers that could fire at you, which was a good design. And their tracks in used to come in between the bunker, so that you didn't, if you were following the track, you'd be between 2 bunkers before you knew it. There was a good design.
So just going back to that first patrol, how was the ambush set?
Usually we lined along a path, and they put a tripwire and a flare down further, and another one up the path. So anybody can't, for at night, that was a flare. In the daytime we didn't do that because you could see, and the ambush we just set on visual, and the machine guns would be set up such a way that they'd fire across the track and down the track. Claymore mines would be put out so that their blast went down the track. And they were done fairly quickly, and you could set up an ambush very quickly. But at night you used to put a flare down the track. And one of the biggest ambushes I was in, it was just on daylight, and the soldier had gone out to take the flare off the tripwire, and he'd just taken the tripwire down, and he saw some Viet Cong coming up the path, and he hurried back in, and the platoon commander just said, wait, we won't trip this ambush until we know how many there is. And there was just 100 or so coming up the path. So he let about 10 go through before he hit the main body, and we killed 22 in that ambush. It was a big ambush. It was just lucky that the fellow had gone out and got the wire off the trip flare, because if they'd hit the flare, they wouldn't have been up right up to the ambush.
And then what would have happened?
Oh, they would have all dispersed and got away. But by letting them come right through the ambush, he killed more enemy. We were rear protection for that ambush. They had the killing group out the front, and then we were just 50 metres behind them, looking the other way, as in case somebody came around and attacked us from the rear. And that used to happen a lot with the 4 observers. We were never active in that group, because we were used as artillery observers, so we'd be rear protection a lot of times. It was still a job, but it wasn't right in the action. You were sort of removed from the action because your action was a different job. So that was a funny sort of a situation to be in. But then I suppose the same with the platoon commander. He had to coordinate all the action, but he never took part in it. He was the centre of it, but he had to delegate and see the whole thing as a whole.
So on that first patrol, what was the landscape like that you were in?
Generally flat, rough scrub. We weren't in rainforest or jungle. It was just rough scrub. You could see probably 50 metres at a time, and there were some clearings. It was reasonably open country, more open than we expected. And then we went into what they call bamboo country, which was all bamboo, 10 metres high and just big clumps of bamboo. That was sort of along the stream. But it wasn't as thick as we thought we'd be in. We were in a lot thicker at different stages, but it was fairly open.
And what was the setup for sleeping?
Just we had to dig a trench 6 feet long and as wide as we wanted, and sleep below the ground. So you'd put your hoochie up and dig your trench, or dig your trench, put your hoochie up, ground sheet and sleep in that.
So what was that first night like, sleeping out on patrol?
Pretty hard. Oh no, we'd slept on the ground at Rockhampton and Canunga, and yeah, you know, we were young, we didn't have too many aches and pains, so yeah, just wasn't too bad. But then, mind you, through the night we all had to do a turn on the machine gun as a sentry, so you never had a full night's sleep. Whatever time it was that you went onto the sentry, somebody'd come and get you and you'd go on sentry. And that might be an hour and a half or 2 hours, depending on how many of you there were.
And where would the sentry be placed in terms of where the rest of the troops were sleeping?
Well, he would be, the machine gun was the sentry point. So if the machine gun was up this side or this side, wherever the machine gun was, and it was usually looking out over a pathway or whatever the perceived threat was where the machine gun was. So what used to happen, one fellow would come off, there was always two on sentry on each gun. So one fellow would come off, he'd come and get his relief, take him back to the gun, and then he'd go to bed. And then the next fellow would go and he'd take his relief back to the gun. So if you did 2 hours on the gun, 1 hour would be with a new fellow. There was always somebody going onto the gun every hour, because you just can't stare into the darkness and stay awake for 2 hours. Or if you do, all the trees will start to move and, you know, you start imagining things. So there was always somebody fresh coming onto the sentry point. And it was a good idea, because the fresh fellow could then relieve the fellow that was stale and look out into the night. And usually the stale fellow would have a bit of a sleep. But there was always somebody there awake.
But given it's night time, what are you on alert for?
Oh,
what can you see?
You can't see anything. You would only be on alert for Viet Cong moving at night, which they did. But usually it was just for your security, so that you didn't get attacked by... mind you, we killed a lot of pigs and deer and things that walked into our ambushes, because they tripped the flare, and as soon as the flare went off, you just hit the claymore mines and blasted the area. So sometimes it was a pig, sometimes it was a deer, all sorts of things got killed in the ambushes. And of course, if that happened, everybody go, oh, you know, because they're all being woken up, and you know, it was just one of the things that happened to us.
What sort of talk was there with that? You mentioned that those men who had been there a long time were somewhat matter of fact. What sort of advice or what sort of conversations did you have with them when you first joined them?
Oh, they treated us as green. They knew we were green. They had a lot of fun with us. And we did the same to the next lot. They just knew it all. They were just been there a year. They just knew it all, and we were so naive to what was going on that they just brought us up to speed very quickly. And I don't think we had. They didn't belittle us, but they just made sure that they were top dog. They knew what was going on, and we didn't. That's about all. And we did the same to the next lot. And the funny thing, we'd been there a fortnight before the 6th Battalion arrived. So when the 6th arrived, we were the veterans. We'd been there a fortnight. So we sort of knew more than they did. It was a funny sort of thing.
Okay. Frank, I just wanted to ask you about the work that you did as part of that unit.
Mm.
Could you explain some of the episodes that you most remember in terms of close calls with the enemy?
Well, yes, one night we were in a harbour position which was a circular defence system that we had. We'd just harbour up in a circle, and we were on a slope, probably 20-degree slope, and we dug into the slope thinking of the enemy coming from that direction. So we didn't dig our trenches any deeper than that deep at the front, and there was nothing behind us. Pardon me. And the enemy came from that direction. So they actually fired into our position up the slope. So anybody that was only half dug in had no protection at all, because you were lying on a slope and the enemy were looking up at it. That was a very scary night, because they kept up their fire for half the night, just 2 or 3 in the jungle. The machine gunner couldn't get them. The artillery wasn't effective because they were too close to us, and wherever they fired at us, we had no cover except for the jungle around us. And that was, I would consider, a very close call. I can still remember lying on the ground and watching the tracer from their rifles going just above us, and thinking they don't know exactly where we are. They knew where the machine gunner was because he was firing at them, and he was down the slope from us, and so anything that went above him came almost into where we were, and that was frightening because we couldn't go anywhere, and we couldn't fire back because it would have given away our positions, and there was no point in firing back. And whatever we did was useless. We just had to lie there and hope that they didn't exactly know where we were. That was pretty scary.
What kind of warning would you have that the enemy was nearby before contact? Would it
None. It was just bang, 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 bang. It was just instant. The forward scout, if you were moving, you had the forward scout that would usually ran into the enemy, and he would fire a couple of shots and maybe get shot back at, and that was the initiation of a contact. When you were going, when you were at night in a static position, unless they came the way you expected them to and tripped off your flares, no, not very much warning at all, if there was any warning. Usually they were following tracks, and you'd put your flares on a track, so there was a warning that way. But in the first operation we went on in Vietnam, we had a contact with the enemy every 4 hours for 10 days. And that could have been anywhere through the day or into the night. A couple of times quite late at night, midnight, we had contacts where they had walked into our position, because we didn't move at night. We made a static position and stayed there, usually an ambush position.
What was that like on the nerves, having contact every 4 hours?
Well, we were just so tired after no sleep for days, and only broken sleep when we did sleep. I can remember a sergeant diving into a pit with me and saying, "I've just about had enough of this," because we were just so stressed out and tired. Weary would be, we were just so weary. I don't think we were functioning properly. We were just on automatic. And you just expected it to happen. And after those first 10 days, it started to not happen. It took a while to get used to the idea.
You'd left Nui Dat within a matter of a day to go on your first patrol. When you came back, what was it like back at camp? What time did you have to adjust to being back at Nui Dat?
When we came back, we just our first initial thing was to go and have a good shower, put on some clean clothes, and just generally your own maintenance, and then we just prepared for the next run, because when we got back we were told there'll be another one in 2 days, you'll go out again. So we just got ready for that. There wasn't very much we did. The other men were packing up, ready for their move home, so there wasn't a lot of activity going on, and we just waited. There was no training or anything like that. We just read books, basically, just lay around and waited.
What was your camp life like at Nui Dat?
When we came in off operations, we were supposed to be there for 14 days at a time, and in that 14 days we had a patrol outside Nui Dat, within reasonable close proximity, a few kilometres outside the wire, and that was a 4-day patrol. So you basically got about 10 days in camp. We could go to the movies. We had a store. You could go and buy transistor radio, or a few comforts, different things. We all had record players and tape recorders. They were the big thing to buy. Everybody had a radio in their tent. Conditions were as homely as you could get them. Where we were on good meals, cooked meals, whatever we were in Nui Dat, and we were relatively free to wander around Nui Dat. At night, there were guard duties and pickets, but we missed out on some of that because we were not on the wire. We weren't on the perimeter of Nui Dat, and they made up for that in other ways, but we might do an extra patrol or whatever, because we didn't have to man the wire like other companies had to. By a quirk of their design, they'd put another unit just in front of us on the wire, so we missed out on a bit of wire running past our camp part. And then it was fairly boring. We would go to training sessions if the battalion or a company had a certain experience, like sometimes our forward scouts would get shot at by somebody back down the line. There were a few incidents where the forward scouts had been wounded by their own men because he'd taken a turn. Nobody knew that he was going to be over there. Somebody'd see something move and fire at him, and it was the forward scout. So he used to go to sessions that pointed out these things. There might have been 2 or 3 of them through the time we were back at Nui Dat. So there was always that upgrading of information that we had to go and look at. But basically it was looking after your gear. Occasionally we'd have a range shoot where we'd go out just outside the wire to a rifle range that they had and just zero your rifles in, have a bit of practice. And then sometimes you would have other units showing what they could do, like the tanks came one day and showed what they could do and showed us how to operate around a tank so that we didn't get run over or something equally as bad. So there was a lot of that going on in the time that we were back in Nui Dat.
You mentioned the incidences of friendly fire with the forward scout. Were there any incidences that you were involved in with the artillery and friendly fire?
No. I saw an incident where there was a friendly fire incident where a gun was offline and was landing shells well away from the target area. Potentially it was dangerous, but there was nobody there, so it wasn't dangerous, but it was a mistake on one of the guns. It wasn't an Australian battery, thank goodness, but it could have had a big potential because they were a long way offline. But we had probably not so much close encounters with our own artillery, except what we directed. Wherever we directed it, so long as we knew where the first shells were landing, it was all right. Tall trees were our major worry for friendly fire from the artillery. But we never had any instances in our unit that I don't think so, no. But remember, when they're firing artillery, it's not a real precision gun, and the spread of shell fire would be over a couple of 100 yards anyhow, just from one gun. The first shell might land at one point, the next one might be 50 metres away from it. Just they weren't that accurate, and you had other influences on just the terrain. The first shell might have been just over a ridge, and the next one might have been back at the top of it. So there were always little variations, but we didn't have any that I was personally aware of.
You'd mentioned the trees before. What would happen if the trees were in the way of the artillery?
Well, we always fired with that first shell a long way away, and if you were aware of the height of the trees and a ridge line or something like that, they would fire them up and down so that they were coming in at a different angle, not such a low trajectory. When you're firing them, we used to hear the shells just go over the trees just above us. Sometimes, when you're at extreme range, we never ever worried about it, but it was a potential if there had been a tall tree. So I think you're a bit aware of that if the terrain and the trees were against you. And that's how you overcame it, or you didn't fire the artillery. You just didn't use it in that particular spot and hope that you didn't have to use it. So we probably would have used it had we had to, but we didn't just fire the shells to register a target. They were a bit more careful in that respect.
When you were communicating between the infantry and the artillery, who were you communicating with? Who were the...
Directly to the battery, 101 battery's command post, and we were on his net. So there were four observers with 4 different companies, and they were all directly in communications with the battery, and it went straight to the command post.
Where was the command post?
Wherever the guns were. If it was back at Nui Dat, it was in Nui Dat, but if the guns had gone out to a fire support base, the command post was there. Excuse me. So you just went to the command post where the battery was.
Was there ever any problems with the communications in terms of the equipment that you were using?
Not so much the equipment, but just the terrain and your distance from for your radio reception. And the wet, often you had to dry your handset out because it wouldn't work properly. That was one of the things that used to happen. You'd be there busily, you'd pull the handset apart and put it all in close to you and warm it up and dry it out and put it all back together and hope it worked. But by and large, I think it worked fairly well. But remember, there wasn't just your radio. There was an infantry radio that was in contact with the battalion headquarters, and then there was another radio that was in contact with the rest of the platoons. So in each platoon, you probably had 2 or 3 radios, and then there was a spare radio as well. So it wasn't just your radio. If you were having problems, well, then you'd relay through one of the other radios.
Were you supporting different infantry units at different times, or was it always the same?
It was always, well, the battery was probably supporting, but I was only with one unit. We were with the 6th Battalion D Company, and we just went with different platoons. So we were rotated around in the platoons. We maintained we did a lot more work than a lot of fellows, because if there was one platoon resting, we went out with the platoon that wasn't resting, which was pretty true. We did a lot of that. They'd bring one platoon into an area and say, well, you're not going to patrol for a day or so, and another one would do a lot of patrolling, and we'd go out with that platoon then. So we did pick up a lot of extra patrolling just because of that.
What was it like for you to join up with different platoons at different times? Did that have an impact on how you operated?
We used to join up as a whole company for a resupply a lot of times, where the company would be in one base and they'd fly the supplies into us, and when you met up with the platoons, you met up with different mates you had, and that was about the only time you really talked like we're talking. You didn't talk very much when you were out on patrol. It was all pretty quiet, and when you did talk, it was softly. There was no yahooing or singing out or anything like that. It was all very quiet, and so when you had a resupply, you could have a bit of a laugh and a joke and yahooed a bit, because you were in a bigger base. Everybody knew where you were because of the helicopters, so there was no sort of secrecy about it, and so you relaxed a little bit in that time frame. It was a time to be a bit easier.
What was the longest that you were out for?
Nearly 3 months. We went out for one operation and they extended that into another operation, and then another operation, and it went on like that. We didn't come back to Nui Dat. We went out in September sometime, didn't come back until after Christmas. So we were in the field the whole time.
Could you explain what was happening over those 3 months, what you were doing and what the purpose was?
Well, the first, I'm just trying to think what operation it was. Where most of the operations were search and destroy. Search out an area, find the Viet Cong bunker systems, their food caches, supply depots and all that sort of thing, and destroy it. Search and destroy was the basic operational target. And so we would go on those operations and just search out whole areas of ground and find what we could and destroy it. And then they extended that into the next operation. We went into what they called the May Tower Mountains, which they hadn't been in from about 1966. We were the first back in there in 1969, and we actually found a hospital complex and a dental clinic and quite a big resupply area for the whole of the province we were in. And we captured lots of ammunition and medical supplies, and it was quite a big complex.
Were there the enemy there as well?
Oh yes, there was enemy there as well. Yeah, we took 2 or 3 days to work our way up to it. It was in a mountain complex, and there were caves and bunker systems and all sorts of things. They knew we were coming. They were deserting it as we came into the area, and there were a few wounded soldiers left behind by them that they couldn't move, so they were taken prisoner. And there were quite a few contacts just getting into the complex. And once we got into the complex, it was pretty much deserted by the time we got in there.
What did that tell you about how organised the enemy were?
Well, I can remember we captured all these old rifles and old shotguns, and we were so happy. We thought, oh, look at all these weapons we've captured. And I remember the company sergeant major said, "What do you do with an old weapon?" And we said, "Oh, we take it to the Q store and hand it in and get a new one." And he said, "Well, what do you think these are?" "They're all old weapons. They've handed them in and they've got brand new ones. So they're out there with brand new ones." He said, "Don't cheer too loudly because you're getting the wrong message from all this stuff." So yeah, it was a sobering thought that they'd all brought in their old rifles and had new ones. But we captured a lot of material, and whether he was right or not, I don't know, but it was a thought that, yes, maybe they were doing just exactly what we would do, just upgrading their gear.
Was that the most organised base that you came across?
I would think so, yes, because it hadn't been touched for years before we went in there. And I can remember helping smash up rifle mechanisms, and I spent most of the day with a little anvil and a hammer just smashing up these mechanisms so that they couldn't be used again. And as they searched out through the base, they found more and more stuff, and there was heaps of medical supplies, which wasn't destroyed. It was flown back and given to the South Vietnamese.
Was there evidence of where these supplies had come from?
Yes, we were a little bit surprised. A lot of the medical supplies was in National Red Cross, which, of course, in National Red Cross don't take sides. But we thought it was a bit funny that we were capturing their stuff. The rifles and the ammunition were Russian or Chinese. And some American stuff, but it would have been Second World War ammunition. So it came from all over.
How were they living in that base?
Oh, they had their bunkers, and they had kitchens. A lot of them were under big rocks in almost caves. And they had a water supply, which was a nice stream running through the place. They had wicker beds with holes in them for pans for the wounded to lie on. They had a complete dental chair made out of bamboo with the headrest and everything. A pedal drill set for doing teeth. They were well set up. And it amazed us at the ingenuity of having all these beds made out of bamboo in the hospital complex. And the hospital complex might have had 30 beds in a row, all under bamboo and thatched roofs. They were sort of in beside rocks, but not under rocks. They were out in the open a bit, but very dense overhead cover from the jungle.
How many soldiers do you think would have been based there?
I think they said it was a couple of hundred beds in the hospital. So I don't know how many people would have been guarding it. But probably a company or 2 companies, a couple of hundred men. It was quite a big complex.
Was this a surprise to you to see them so well organised? Was this what you'd been told about the enemy?
It was a bit of a surprise that they was. I think we sort of looked at it and respected them a bit more for it because it was a very organised thing. I don't think it was a surprise to the commanders. I think they knew it was going to be fairly complex, but we didn't quite appreciate how complex it was going to be. Maybe they didn't either, I don't know. But it was a very complex thing.
Had intelligence known that this base was there?
Yeah, they knew what we were going to find in respect of what unit was there. They had a name for it. It was it was a hospital complex. I just can't remember the name of the hospital complex, but it was named, and they knew it was there somewhere. They didn't know exactly where. They knew it was in this mountain complex, and we had to search for it. I think we were probably 10 days before we found it. So they knew it was somewhere in there. They didn't know exactly where. And though I remember there was quite a bit of jubilation among the officers when they'd found it, because they had, we found it at last. And we actually found what they thought was the pharmacy and the dispensary the day before, and they knew we were close because we'd found a dispensary. And they found another company found the hospital only a few hundred metres from where we were in another little valley. So we missed out on finding the hospital. I think it was a bit of a competition to see who was going to find it. But it was quite a big thing.
What was the dispensary like?
If I remember correctly, we just it was down between two huge boulders. I mean huge, they were big as a house. And there'd been a cavity, and it was just all the pharmaceuticals were just stored there. And there was different caves, and there were different caches. There were caches of explosives and rifles, and yes, we found a lot of stuff. And it would have made a difference to them. They didn't then have a base for their hospital. That was the idea, to deny them a base so that the chaps in the field would give up. Whether they did or not, I don't know.
You said that it took a while to sort of find where this hospital was. How well was it disguised, or?
It didn't have to be. The jungle was just so thick. You wouldn't have been able to see 10 yards in any direction. It was just thick jungle. Sometimes you could see further, but mostly it was just impenetrable. You'd see the man in front of you and you'd see the man behind you, and you wouldn't see any further than those two when you were going along some of the paths. It was just, and it was a lovely green, everything was green. We were green. You just, yes, disappeared into the greenness of it. And it was quite thick. We went one day, had to go off into it, not on a track, but just to make our own track. And I think we went 400 metres in a day. And it was just so thick. We were crawling. A lot of the time we were just crawling to get it under the vines and through the underbrush. So it's quite different to anything you can see around here. It's just, this is so open, you can't believe that you couldn't see more than 10 yards.
So you're crawling and making your way through this thick jungle. What's the emotion when you stumble across something like a cache of pharmaceuticals?
I think you were glad you'd found something. Probably. I just can't remember thinking of it. Relieved you'd found something. Otherwise, it just got so totally straining and boring. You just, we've got to go another 100 yards or whatever we've got to do. We've got to go through this and this and this, and at the end there mightn't be anything. And that was a lot of the things we used to patrol and patrol and patrol, there'd be nothing. All the time you'd do that. It was very draining to just do things and no result at the end of it.
So were those medical supplies, were they carried out or were they choppered out? Or?
Well, they were chop it out, yes. We, me and another chap, we volunteered, still very stupidly. They said, does anybody know how to cut a tree down? And I do. And this other chap said, I do. And they handed us a cross-cut saw that they'd captured. And they said, we want a helicopter pad out there, you know. And we went out, there's all these trees, 200 feet tall. And they said, cut down as many as you can to make a helicopter pad. So we did, with a cross-cut saw. We cut down 11 trees, me and this other chap. And they were all, you know, 2 feet thick and very tall. And the helicopter came down in our little hole that we'd made to chop the things out. Yeah.
How long did that take you?
Oh, most of the day, I think, if I remember rightly. Yeah. He was a Tasmanian. He thought he knew how to cut trees down, and I did too, so we spent the day cutting trees down. And the last one wouldn't fall over. It just stood there, and it wouldn't fall over. And when the helicopter arrived, he said, I'll fix that up, and he blew it over. He hovered in front of it and then blew it over. So that was our last, and we had a helicopter pad, which was very good. And then they brought us supplies and took out whatever they had to take out. Yeah.
So after finding that hospital, how much longer were you on patrol for? Did you find anything else on that particular 3-month expedition?
Lots of bunker systems, lots of signs of where the enemy had been, and yes, lots of things like that. But that was commonplace. We'd find bunker systems because they would build a bunker system in a few days. Wherever they stopped, they would start digging in immediately, and after they'd been there a week, they'd have a bunker system. It was a defensive position, and they just built it straight away. So as quickly as we destroyed them, they were probably being rebuilt, which was a little bit off-putting. All that effort to knock them down, they were building them as quick as you could knock them down.
How would their bunker system work? What was their methodology of linking it?
Well, they'd have a central bunker in the middle, and then a star pattern, usually, with bunkers around it. And if you hit the bunker system coming in, the tracks then would come in between the bunker systems. So if you came along a track, along their track, you would get between two bunkers. And that was the danger of getting ambushed in a bunker system, because you'd be in the bunker system and they knew where you were and you didn't really know where they were, because you could be 20 yards from them and not see them, because the bunkers just blended into the undergrowth. But they could see where you were, and sometimes the forward scouts would find signs that there'd been a bit of clearing here, and it was a fire zone, so they could see you. And if the forward scout was good, he'd pick all that sort of stuff up.
What were some of the booby traps that they would use? Would they set them up around it?
We never came across a lot of booby traps. They laid mines for us, and they were our mines that they were pinching out of the minefields. But that only happened in the south of the province, not so much up in the north. But they would set mines for you on known paths where you're going. But not so much out in the primary jungle, because they were out there too, and so they would have to leave a sign of where a mine was, and it might be just 2 cross sticks against a tree, and that would warn them that in that vicinity was a mine. So if you saw that, you knew there was a mine there somewhere. But that was usually forward scout or the second scout had picked that up. But in the primary jungle, there wasn't too many booby traps that we came across. I think they'd moved on from the booby trap era when we were there. they were more organised and better armed. And it wasn't just Viet Cong, there was North Vietnamese. And I think that made a difference.
Was that something that people were aware of, that their methodology was changing throughout the years?
I think so. I think so. I think they would have been. We were certainly aware of it. So I would expect they were too. It seemed to me that it had changed because we were taught all about the booby traps and we never saw any. But we were still getting lots of casualties and they were using as good a weapons as, and they had, when the Australia was told, when the first Australian tanks went over there, they didn't have any anti-tank weapons. But within months of our tanks arriving there, they had anti-tank weapons. So they'd upgraded to meet that challenge with anti-tank weapons.
How different was it for you to fight the North Vietnamese army as aside from the Viet Cong?
It appeared to us in contacts that the North Vietnamese were a little bit more aggressive. They would attack. They actually attacked our platoon on 2 occasions where we always thought that we attacked them. And they waited for us and then they attacked us. They waited for one evening while we put up our perimeter and then they attacked. And they used mortars on us. And this was just unheard of. We thought, gee, what's happening here? We're supposed to attack them. That happened twice. And I think that was just better training, probably better equipment for them, and that's what they did.
Could you explain the first time you experienced them attacking and when that was or what happened at that time?
It would be late 1969 and we were on the edge of a rubber plantation and we'd set up our harbour and we'd just gone about our afternoon or evening ritual. We'd had our dinner and we were about to just sort of settle down for the evening, and all that meant was we were in our weapon pits and we dug our weapon pits and I was in company headquarters here and there was a platoon about 100 metres away and all of a sudden that platoon started to receive fire and radioed to us that we were under attack and we radioed the guns that was contact. And then they came back on the radio and said, they're mortaring us. Hurry up with the guns or something like that. And the attack went on for 10 minutes, I suppose, of the Vietnamese attacking the platoon. And then we called the guns in and started fire at the artillery. And I can remember the artillery observer with the platoon calling the artillery onto the grid reference that they were at. And the guns came back and said, that's your location. And they said, where's the enemy? And the fellow said, that's where the enemy are, in our location. You know, fire the guns on that position. And so they did. They fired the guns on the same reference point as the platoon. And that made the Vietnamese back off. But the shells landed in, there was nobody hurt on our side because they were in their trenches and that. But that's a pretty close encounter for them because they actually called the artillery onto their position. And then later in the evening, I can't remember if it was the same day or another incident, but not too far away, we were mortared again, and this time we both heard the mortars out from our position fire, and so we would get two platoons got a grid reference, and we fired artillery on that grid reference. And the next day we went out and found where the mortar had been, and blood trails going off into the jungle. So we'd actually hit the mortars that were firing at us just by putting artillery where we thought they were. So that was a good lesson in how good artillery was. because it stopped the mortaring straight away.
How would you get a grid reference? How would you actually do that?
Well, when you fired an artillery shell, you knew it was going to land on a certain point, so you just took a bearing back from that, marked it on your map, and you usually, if you had 2 or 3 things that were going on, you could get a pretty good idea where you were exactly. When we were moving, I had a counter on my rifle that I used to count every second step. The fellow behind me, he had a counter and he would count every step. And then the sergeant, he had a counter and he would estimate how far he thought we'd come. And so every 5 minutes or so he'd think, right, I've come 100 metres, and he'd just click it up to 100. So there were 3 of us measuring how far we went. So at the end of a day, we'd sit down together and say, well, I've come 3,000 steps. And other fellows said, I've come 5,000 steps. And the sergeant say, well, I've estimated we've come 4,500 or something like that. So you had some gauge of where you were in distance. Direction was a little bit harder, but if you were generally going north, you said, right, well, we were here this morning, we're somewhere in that area tonight. And that was just on dead reckoning. Then when you fired your defensive fire for the night with the artillery, you would listen for where the shells were landing and take a bearing off them, and that got you to position. So usually we weren't too far off doing it that way. We only had one time where one of our platoons got lost and they had no idea where they were. And I can remember the infantry chap coming up on the radio and said, we don't know where we are. He had no idea. They were in particularly thick jungle and it was all flat. And he said, we've got no references, we can't see any hills, we've been walking around down in here for 3 days and we just don't know where we are. And I can remember the artillery radio operator, he called a mission in and he added 1,000 and he said, we don't know where we are, this might land right on top of us. It didn't, but he didn't even hear it, so they were a long way away from it. They were probably 2 or 3 kilometres from where they thought they were.
Frank, you mentioned earlier that sometimes American artillery would be used. What would happen there?
Well, we'd come up on their net. We had a list of artillery units that were in our range or even outside our range, and we'd come up on their radio frequency. They would then challenge us to as who we were, and we had to authenticate our call sign through our codes, give them a code, and they would respond with it being correct or incorrect so that they knew who we were. And then we would just go on as if they were our guns. And one night we were out of range of everything except for an 8-inch battery which was 23 miles away. And we called it up and got them to fire a mission for us, which was quite a thing because they were so far away. The time of flight for the shell was something like 70 seconds before it got to us. So it was a long way away. And it sounded like a freight train in the sky coming towards us. And that was one night we called the American guns. But an 8-inch shell was a big shell, 200 pounds it weighed. It came 20-something miles. It was quite awe-inspiring. But that's all we did to get support from the American guns. So long as they knew who we were, and they'd fire for us.
What sort of contact did you have with US forces?
Not very much at all, because the task force was in a province that was was the Australian responsibility. The Americans sent gun units in sometimes and tank units, but we didn't have that much contact with them in the field. We went to an island in the Delta at one stage, and there was an American base that we went into there, but I was only there a few days, and I got some sort of fever, and they sent me to hospital, so I didn't have much contact with the Americans.
What was the fever that you had? What were the symptoms of that?
Oh, just a fever. The doctor said it could have been 1 of 50. So I spent 10 days in hospital. And when I got better, they just sent me back to the unit, which had moved from there to another spot, and just rejoined the unit.
What was your general health like in Vietnam?
Oh, pretty good. We used to get all the shots for plague and tetanus and cholera, and we took 3 tablets a day to stop from getting malaria. But I think we're all fairly healthy, even from being wet and dirty and everything like that. It was amazing how healthy we were, probably.
How did being wet and dirty all the time affect you doing your job?
Oh, it didn't, I don't think it affected you, you just put up with it. You can only get so dirty, and then the dirt falls off. After 3 or 4 days of not washing, you were brown, and the white parts of your skin were in the creases of your hands. You used to have to shave every morning, so you'd have a shave. So this little part of your face was clean. But sleeping on the ground, of course, you just got dirty. And your skin used to flake off under the dirt. You'd have a clean spot where it flaked off. But you were dirty all the time. And you just got used to it. In fact, when they sent clean clothes to you, they used to make you itch. Putting on clean clothes was quite uncomfortable for a day or so, until you sort of got used to the feeling of clean clothes and the soap in them or something or other. But you can only get so dirty, and then it just falls off. When we came back to base, you'd have 2 or 3 showers before you actually got clean, because it was ingrained into your skin. We were sort of had brown hands and brown faces.
Why did you have to shave every day?
Because the army maintained it made you feel good, and I think it did. It made you just feel a little bit ordinary again, normal. So you had to shave, but mind you only shaved in about half a cupful of water, because you weren't going to waste the water, because all the water you had was what you carried. But you always had to shave. And it was just a discipline thing. They didn't want people with beards. Some of us looked wild enough as we were, like mutton chops and moustaches. And, and the regulations on that sort of thing got fairly well stretched. But so long as you had a clean chin, you'd shaved.
Did you try and do funny things with your facial hair?
I didn't have enough to worry about. I couldn't even grow a moustache properly, so I used to have a full shave. But mind you, it was fairly painful because you didn't have much water and not much soap to use, so I just had an ordinary shave, as much as I could. Yeah.
I guess being 20-year-old boys, you didn't really have a lot to shave, did you?
No, I didn't. I've never had a problem with shaving, too much hair. Yeah.
What were the defences like around Nui Dat?
Pretty good. There was about 8 kilometres or more of barbed wire entanglements right around the base, and then there were strong points where they had 50 calibre machine guns. And then every company that faced the wire had a machine gun nest. It was a fairly secure type of place. I don't think you would have been able to attack it without a lot of casualties. And then you had the artillery in the base itself, which would have been able to defend itself. It would have been a fairly big job to attack the base itself. They used to fire the odd rocket into it from a distance out. And the day we arrived, they fired 2 rockets to welcome the 6th Battalion, because they knew when they were going to arrive. They'd read it in the Sydney Morning Herald. So much for security in that respect.
Were you there when the rockets landed?
Because we were the forward element. We were there before the 6th Battalion. And when the 6th Battalion arrived, the day they arrived, these 2 rockets came into the base. But remember, the base was about 3 miles long and a mile wide. And I think one bloke got wounded, and he'd have to be unlucky just to be in the wrong spot at the wrong time from these rockets, because there was a lot of empty space in the base that the rockets could have landed on. But I always remember that as thinking, today they just knew when the 6th Battalion arrived. Somebody had rung them up and said, 6th Battalion's arriving. I think that was one of the worst aspects of the whole thing. We knew less than what was generally going on. If we'd been getting the Sydney Morning Herald and reading it on the day over there, we would have known what was going on. But because we didn't get papers or anything, we didn't know what was going on around the place. You know what I mean?
But how did you know that this was... What sense did you get of how well publicised a war it was?
By that. It used to worry us. I've spoken to other fellows about this. We didn't know what to write in our letters home to Mum and Dad because we didn't know what they knew. If we knew that they knew nothing, we could have told them what we wanted them to know, like, don't worry about me, I'm this far from the enemy or whatever. You could have just said, this is where I am and what I'm doing. But because we didn't know what they'd read or heard on the news, we couldn't tell lies in our letters. So you had to be very specific of what you were telling them, because you just didn't know what they'd heard. It'd be no good sending them a letter and saying, don't worry about me, if your paper, if the paper said this unit was doing such and such. That used to worry. Quite a few of us talked about that at the time. You know, what do you say to Mum and Dad when you know they probably know more about what's going on than we do? And that was a bit disconcerting.
So what were the nature of your letters that you were sending home?
Well, you try to just talk about the day-to-day things you're doing, but when we were out on operations, I used to be fairly specific to Dad and Mum and say the enemy were 500 yards away, or they went that way, or you know, and try to not make them anxious. But I've realised since that it probably didn't do any good anyhow, because if they thought the enemy was 500 yards away, they think, my goodness, how much closer do you get? Not thinking that 20 yards, most of our contacts were at 20 yards. You know, so that's not very far away. But in a jungle, you might be able to see 20 yards. But most of our contacts were at 20 yards. Forward scout and the enemy would be 20 yards apart when the firing started. And then most of the firing was done at under 50. You know, so they were fairly close encounters all the time, because there was no open areas. We went into open areas, but we didn't have the contacts like in the jungle.
Did you go into any villages?
We did cordons and searches, where you would cordon off the village, put a perimeter around it, and then get everybody out, check all their papers, search the huts, look for sign of enemy there. Sometimes there'd be young men that papers weren't right and they were just taken to the South Vietnamese authorities. Mostly it was old men and children, women and children, because the South Vietnamese army was calling up young men all the time. So we did searches like that. We didn't do many. We did a couple, and one we should have done. We went past this village on a patrol one day, a full company patrol, and the company commander said, he said we should go in there and cordon that village and just search it right now, like that. And he actually called the battalion commander and said, I'd like to do a cordon search of that village. And the commander said, no, we haven't got time for that, we've got to be such and such, keep going. And we went past, and about a week later, he heard from the intelligence that that day, the commander of the enemy battalion and all his cadre and all the underlings of that area were having a meeting in that village. Had we gone in and searched it, we would have captured all the headquarters of all the enemy units in our area. We just didn't go in. So he can come close. You know, just one of those things. We went past and that was it.
How difficult was it to determine what the enemy presence was in this province?
Well, there were no-go areas for the civilians, right? So anybody in that area was an enemy. There was a curfew from 7 in the morning, 7 at night till 7 in the morning. So anybody out of their village at that time was enemy, and that's how civilian casualties happened. Because you had people that thought, oh, there's nobody about, I'll go down to the fields or I'll go fishing or whatever they were doing before curfew was lifted, and they'd end up getting ambushed. So once you were in the jungle, anybody out there wasn't supposed to be there in a lot of areas. So the to identify the enemy was reasonably easy in that area, because you knew anybody out there was enemy. And in some instances, when we went into specific areas, that was the order: anybody out here is enemy. Don't worry about asking questions. They shouldn't be here. And they'd been warned and they'd been told, and yeah, it was enemy territory. So the identification wasn't hard, not for us. You know, they were soldiers, and that was it. I don't know about back at the more populated areas. We didn't just go into them. We seemed to be always out in the extended areas further out from civilization.
What impact did it seem that the war was having on those villages and the civilian populations?
I think in some villages their lot in life had improved. They had roads. For the first time they had all-weather roads. They had a windmill and a tank and a cleaner, better water supply than they had. So some of those places probably improved. Maybe the infrastructure in the cities and towns hadn't improved because of the war, but at least there were all-weather roads throughout the province that wasn't there before the Australians went there. So that would have been an improvement, I think. A lot of them were making money out of the troops, plenty of money about. So I think their lot had improved. To the peasant in the paddy field, I don't think it made a jot of difference to him. And we used to often think, you know, it doesn't matter who's in government, he's still going to be doing that. But I think generally the standard of living was lifting a little bit for a lot of people. They built an undercover market area for the produce market. It was just in an open paddock at one stage, and they built this big complex so that everything was undercover, out of the weather. That would have to been an improvement for the local traders and for everybody in general, I would think.
Where was that?
Halfway to Vung. I can't think of whether it was in Berea or somewhere like that. But it was quite a big complex. You know, not to the standards of, say, Woolworths, but you know, undercover, different facilities in the place. Yeah.
Were there occasions where you took prisoners?
Yes, very rarely. Usually they had to be wounded, and they were just taken prisoner. They were flown back to an appropriate hospital and then handed over to the South Vietnamese.
Can you describe an incident where you took someone prisoner?
Yeah, it's a rather funny incident. Not funny for the poor prisoner, but funny for everybody else. We shot this fellow, and he ran away, and we chased him and threw a hand grenade at him, and by now he's wounded fairly badly, and the first thing he wanted when we captured him was a cigarette. You know, so a chap gave him a cigarette. We thought he had so many little shrapnel wounds, we thought the smoke would come out all over him. He's still conscious, and he had a bullet through his leg, a bullet through his side, and all these shrapnel wounds. And we called a helicopter to take him out. And the helicopter arrived, and he couldn't get down, so he sent down a thing that goes down through the jungle. Well, that's what he was going to do, but he decided no, he wouldn't do that. He'd send a litter down, which is one of these stretchers where you bind people to them. And that's what we wanted, so we could get him out. And we were all standing in a group, and the interpreter told the prisoner to shut his eyes so that he didn't get dirt in them from the helicopter. And we were all sort of standing there going like this. And we were all watching up. And the crewman just threw this litter out. And it came down, and we were like, ah! And it went and stood on its end in the ground. It had gone into the ground about that far from this poor prisoner, who was lying on the ground with his eyes fast shut. He didn't even see it, thank goodness. He would have thought we were trying to murder him. As that landed, a limb fell off the tree under the helicopter, and I was the only one watching it. And I saw this limb coming, and I just said to everybody, out of the way, and I pushed a few fellas back. And one fella tripped over the litter and fell over there, and the one chap turned to me and said, what? And as he said, what? This limb, about that round, just landed fair on his head, and he just went, so he fell over. And we've still got the poor old Vietnamese lying there with his eyes shut. Now there's a limb fallen next to him, and I turned around to the fella next to me, and he's got a whopping gash in his head. You know, it just peeled back almost scalped him, peeled back his scalp. And he's unconscious, and blood going everywhere. And the lieutenant came in and was looking after him, and I turned to another fellow and handed him the butt of my rifle and said, get that dressing, because we had our dressings tied to our rifles, taped to our rifles. I said, get that dressing off. So he grabbed the butt of my rifle, and he's pulling this dressing. And the lieutenant looks over and sees me and this other fella presumably fighting over this rifle. And he thought one of us was going to shoot this Vietnamese for making all this trouble. See? And we're only trying to get the dressing. So he left that fellow and came over and broke us up. I said, we're trying to get... And oh, okay. So we went back. And then this fellow's still lying there unconscious. So we rolled the Vietnamese out of the litter we'd had him in the litter by now, we rolled him out of the litter onto the ground again, put our fellow in, and sent him up. And the poor Vietnamese, he didn't know what was going on. And you wouldn't know, but they took our fellow into the helicopter, got him out of the litter, and threw the litter out again. So the whole thing was repeated. This litter come down again, into the ground beside it. He's trying to kill us all. And we finally got the prisoner into the litter and sent him off. And I often thought afterwards what that poor Vietnamese, he'd been shot and then he'd been nearly hit by the litter twice and had a limb land on him. Like, if he was any way a gambler, he would have wanted to take a lottery ticket because he was the luckiest fellow. It was the funniest thing. And by then our fellow had regained consciousness, and he was sitting up in the helicopter saying what happened, because he didn't know what had happened. One minute he was on the ground, next minute he's in a helicopter. So it was a very funny situation, very funny. And then to make matters worse, when he got to hospital, they dug a piece of wood out of his head, the size of a bullet. And they said to him, "You got shot in the head." Because he didn't know. He was still he might have been conscious, but he wasn't with it. But he didn't know what had hit him. He didn't see it. So it was only us on the ground that knew what had happened. Nobody at the hospital knew what had happened. And they thought this was a bullet. And they said, "You got shot in the head." And he said, "Oh, God," he said, "what about all the other fellows?" Thinking that we were in a group. If he'd got shot in the head, there must be other fellows. And I said, "No, there's nobody else, just you." And so for days he believed that he didn't know what to believe. And they actually sent home a telegram saying he'd been mortally wounded to his parents, which I found dreadful. You know, his parents got this thing, he'd been shot in the head. Well, imagine getting a telegram saying he'd been shot in the head. But it was one of the very funny instances that we laughed and laughed at. It was so serious and funny altogether. And the poor Vietnamese prisoner, he must have wondered why he'd given up at the hands of these idiots trying to get him into a helicopter. So I sometimes wonder what happened to the poor man.
Sounds like a Peter Sellers movie.
It was just slapstick all the way. It was so funny, so funny. Well, it wasn't very funny, but it was. Well, we had a few things happen like that. I got lost in the jungle one night. I must tell you, because it's a strange thing. How you take things for granted around you. We pulled up and we put our harbour in, and I went and had to work out where to go to get to the gun, and the other fella came back and got me. And I said, "We've got to go 5 paces this way and 10 paces that way, and we'll be at the gun." He said, "Right, good." So we went 1, 2, 3, 4, and we ran into a wall. We ran into this solid wall. Now, we couldn't see it. The night was so black, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. So, and we run into this wall, and we thought, what is this? Why? Where are we? What is it? And we couldn't reach over it. And we weren't game to go too far, because we had to go 5 paces and then go 10. So I said, "Right, we'll go back to where I was sleeping and start again." So we went back to where I was sleeping. We started again. We went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we didn't run into it. And we couldn't see it, and it wasn't there. I said, "Oh, well, I don't know." And he said, "This is weird." I said, "I don't know what was there." So we went to the gun, and I did my picket. And in the morning, when I woke up, I'd come back another way to where I was sleeping. When I woke up, here is this huge fig tree with a huge buttress root out into the jungle that we'd all seen during the day, but never took any notice of it. But at night, it was the wall. And the second time that we'd started out towards it, we must have been about that far from it, and we're going like this, just in front of it. So we didn't touch it. And I was thinking, oh my goodness. So and through me and my mate, we just couldn't believe, after running into it, then not running into it. That's what threw us. We thought, whoa, this is a weird place. But that's how dark it was in the jungle some nights. It was just absolutely pitch black. And you'd be on the gun, and you'd hear somebody stumbling around out in front of you, and you think, enemy. And then you'd hear him swear when he tripped over. There was somebody that was lost, trying to find their bed. So you always just held off a little bit. If you heard something out there, you just sort of wait a minute. Wait until he trips over and swears, then we'll know it might be an Australian. So when you heard him swear, you'd say, "Hey, psst, over here." He'd come in. Yeah, bloody dark. And he'd go off to his bed. But you'd often hear somebody trip over somebody at night and swear at them, "Get off your bed, you mongrel." Very dark.
What would you do on leave in Vietnam?
We had a club. We had place where you could buy good meals at the club. Just drank beer, sat on the beach. Blokes go downtown, of course, to the bars downtown. We used to go downtown to the bars. That's virtually all. Just didn't. I suppose there were gambling places. Never saw them. Never frequented it. We were only there a day and a half. We'd go down in the morning of one day and come back in the afternoon of the next. So you only had one night there when you're on leave. So it didn't give you a lot of time to get into trouble. I suppose it gave some blokes time to get into trouble. But that's all. Just took it easy. We're happy with the relaxation and to be able to sit around and in a group and just have a few beers and often they'd put on a show for us. There'd be a band or something that'd come into the complex at that time when we were there and just put on a band. And you'd watch telly, which was a good thing. We never saw television otherwise. There was no TV where we were at Nui Dat.
Was the television in the club?
Yeah. If I remember rightly. Yes, there was a television there. But mostly it was American stuff. The Australians had a radio station, which was an Australian radio station. But it was as normal as you could get when you went on leave, and that's just what we did. Oh, we went surfing, swimming. They had a pool there, which was good.
Was this in Vung Tau?
Yeah.
What did it look like?
What, the town? Well, there were two little hills that were sort of nestled between. That was on a spit of land out into the South China Sea. We thought it was pretty dirty. There were a lot of old French colonial houses. You could tell them by the tiled roofs. There was a beachfront, a grand parade. It was the French Riviera of Vietnam. That's where they used to go during the hot periods to get out of Saigon. It was we only went around it once or twice to have a real look at it. I don't remember much more than that about it.
You mentioned that the local Vietnamese, some of them seem to be making money out of the troops. How were people doing that in Vung Tau?
Oh, I'd say all the bars, all the women. There was brothels and prostitutes everywhere. Lots of bars selling beer. So I suppose that's the main thing they were doing. They would make your uniforms. There was a trade in shirts and trousers. You could buy a uniform of any description, any clothes, shoes. It was all that sort of trade. It was pretty good. You could get yourself a shirt and trousers made in an afternoon, sort of thing. So I suppose that was all aimed at the foreign currency.
What did the bars look like?
Oh, a bit like a container with a door on the front. There was nothing too flash about them. A couple of chairs and a table, a few booths and a bar. And most of the drink was just bottled beer or canned beer. And that was about it. And the bar girls would meet you when you went there and ask you to buy them a drink, and if you didn't buy them a drink, they'd soon leave you alone. But if you bought them a drink, they'd be with you all the time. You kept buying them drinks. But they were pretty ordinary sort of places. What
did the bar girls look like?
Unfortunately, they probably all started to look fairly good. They were all teenagers. Looking back on it now, there wouldn't have been very many old girls in the bars. What they looked like, some were very nice looking. There was a mixture of French and Vietnamese, and they were quite good looking girls. Yeah. But that's about all I remember about them.
How often would you get leave? How did the leave structure work?
The leave structure worked that we'd come back off an operation and get a day and a half in the 2 weeks that we were in Nui Dat. It didn't always work that way, but that was the theory of it. And I think in the time we were there, we got 6 leaves in Vung Tau in 12 months, so we didn't get it on a regular basis. And then we had our R&R at some different stage, but that was different to the leave that we were supposed to get. If your operation went over time and you missed out on that slot that you were going there, well, you didn't get it. And that was all it was about it.
What was it like to try and relax on this R&C time when you just come off an operation in the jungle to go surfing and drinking?
I think you automatically relaxed. You just knew you were there for that time and just relaxed. A few beers and you seemed relaxed. Forgot where you were. Yeah.
When you watched the television in the club, were you able to watch news footage of the war?
I can't remember. I really can't remember sitting down and watch, because it was American TV, we just didn't watch it. There wasn't much there to interest us. So I don't think we watched it very often. I can't remember sitting down and just watching it. I can remember more drinking and buying things that you could, just nice things to eat, and going surfing. And movies, when you went to a movie, there was a movie place there too, where they'd have a movie every night, so you went and saw whatever was on at the movies.
Were you aware at that stage of what progress the war was making? Were you able to determine whether you were winning?
Well, we always maintained we were winning, only because we were told that by the commanders that the enemy strength was such and such, and we'd forced him out of this area, and we'd had so many casualties on him in another area, and his strength is now at such and such a stage, and so we would say, yes, we've won, we're beating that enemy here. As far as the wider war went, I don't think we knew. They were still talking peace, and we were still fighting.
What were your thoughts at that stage about coming home?
We didn't dare think about it. We didn't think about it. You weren't allowed to think about it until you had 100 days to go. that was the thought of, you know, if somebody started to say, when I get home, you'd say, hey, no. You don't count the days till you come home.
So what was the mental shift you had once you hit that 100 days?
I think we became more anxious. We were in our 100 days, and we thought, 100 days to go, and you started to count it down, but only to yourself. Yeah, you were more anxious. I think that was one of the things that was upsetting about it. You had a time you had to be there, so there was an end to it. Not like the Second World War where they had no time frame. They were there until it finished. We were there until we'd finished our time. I think that was a strain in itself. When you started to count the days down, that was a strain. And some fellows, it got very bad for them. You know, it was a hard time.
How would that show up in people's behaviour?
One chap just got terribly angry, you know, just raged about things. Another fellow put his photos of his wife up on the... It probably didn't have much to do with him going home at that time, but somebody told him that his wife was playing up, so he got all the photos and shot them off his tent. That was an incident. But I think fellows were just getting edgy. More arguments. You know, we've been together for 9 months, and now you're in your 100 days, you're starting to get a bit edgy.
What sort of stoushes were there in camp?
Not many, but I remember one bad fight between two fellows that didn't like each other from way back, and they had a terrible fight. And we wouldn't let the corporal pull them apart because they'd been at each other for weeks and weeks and weeks, or months. And we just said, let them go until they get it out of their system. Well, they fought each other to a standstill. They couldn't swing a punch at the end. They had, cut eyes and bleeding ears and bleeding mouth and bleeding fists. They just pummeled each other to bits. That was the worst one.
Were they in the same platoon?
No, same company, but not in the same platoon. But things just got the better of them and they let go. Yeah. I think if they had the strength, one of them would have ended up killing the other fellow, but they just ran out of strength. They just knocked each other senseless.
Did you know what the background was to their rivalry?
I think they were a bit racial and ethnic, but I think it was just the strain of the whole thing. It was getting to them. It was one way it came to the fore, and that's what they did. But I don't think they ever made up. They still felt the same about each other to the end to when they came home, but they proved to each other they couldn't beat each other, so I suppose that was something. But they did hate each other.
Were they from different races?
Mm. Yeah. It was a bad thing for to happen in the company, because up until then it was fairly cohesive. But remember, we were getting turned over a lot. After 6 months, we lost a lot of fellows that went back because their time had finished, and then you had casualties all the time. And so by the 9th month, we didn't know a lot of the company fellows because they were reinforcements. And by the end of the time, we only knew a handful of fellows. So the company that went there as a unit at the start was slowly disintegrating because of the turnover of troops going through it. And by the end, we knew the fellows in the tents next to us, and that was about all. So even the officers changed after 6 months. So there was that lost the cohesiveness of the company.
Frank, could you tell me about what your impressions were of the VC as fighters? How were they heroic, or what was their?
I thought they were. I thought they had they believed in what they were doing, or I thought they did. They were game. I think they were game to take us on with the limited weaponry they had. And in some instances, one in particular I remember, I wasn't right on the scene, but I was only 50 yards away. But 3 of them or 4 of them had walked into our position, and the machine gunner had shot at them, and he hit the first fellow as he stepped over a fairly big log. There was a fairly big log on the ground, and he'd certainly killed the first fellow, and he'd flipped back over the log out of sight, and the other 3 went back down the track, returned fire at the machine gunner, and then one of them crawled up, picked his mate up by putting his belt through his belt, and then crawling back out and away, and then they fired at the machine gunner again and got away. And I often thought of that and thought, well, if one of us had done that for one of our fellows, we would have got a medal for it. And I thought that was a very brave thing to do, because the machine gunner didn't stop firing like this fellow did it, with the machine gun firing all the time. And I thought that was very brave, that he'd done that. Some people say, oh, they didn't want us to take their bodies, but this fellow was under fire, and he just crawled back up and picked his mate up and got him back out again. I think that was pretty good.
Did they fight, and were they prepared to fight in the way you had been told back in Canunga in training?
Oh yes, I think so. They had a technique that when they ambushed us, they used to get a rifleman in cover somewhere, looking towards us, and then they'd have another fellow with a rocket-propelled grenade, probably 20 metres behind him. And so when our forward scout or whoever they were going to ambush came up, the rifleman would shoot at him, and 9 times out of 10 hit him. And as soon as they'd done that, before we could come up and organise ourselves to attack them, he would fire this rocket, the other fellow would fire this rocket-propelled grenade at a big tree or something in our general direction. So you would hear the tat-tat-tat-tat-tat of the machine gun or the rifleman, and that was the initial contact. Then you would hear boom, and you knew there was a grenade coming, so everybody had to just get out. And by the time you'd organise yourself after that, they'd gone. It was indefensible. You couldn't not do what you were doing. They'd worked out a technique where they could ambush you and get away without getting shot at. And I think that was a very smart technique, and they used that on us time and time again. And 9 times out of 10 they'd wound or kill the forward scout, because that's how they did it. They did that a lot. And it was a good technique of ambush. And they'd pick their ground so that they might be on the leeward side of a rise, so that when you did fire back that way, they were down behind the rise. And they'd only have to go 50 yards into the jungle and go right or left, and you wouldn't know where they were. So I think they were good. I think they were good fighters.
What was the radio that you used? Could you just explain what it was and how it worked?
It was just a VHF radio with 2 bands, a high and low band, and it was a box about 8 inches by 8 inches by about 4 inches, about as big as 3 house bricks stacked on top of each other. And that just went in my pack, and I carried it everywhere I went, whether I wanted to or not. And it had a battery in the bottom that lasted a couple of days, and you carried a spare battery. And that was the radio set that I had. And you had different aerials. One was an aerial that bent over, that you wore on it when you were moving, so it didn't catch on the limbs and the underbrush. Then there was another one like a fishing rod that you'd use when you were at night, when you wanted better communications. And another type of aerial when you needed to put up an aerial into the trees. So that's all I carried.
So when you were on patrol for a long period of time, how would you recharge the batteries?
You didn't. We just, each resupply we got a new battery and a new spare battery. So every 2 batteries you had to do 4 or 5 days at the most. And you just destroyed them and put them with the rubbish and put a new battery in. There was no problem in having new batteries. There was a problem if you had an old battery. So you were never encouraged to bother about saving a battery. You changed your batteries all the time. It was more important to waste, or more important to have good communications than the waste of a battery.
Were they heavy to carry?
They weighed about 25 pounds, the radio set and the battery. So we were fairly heavy, yeah. And of course it took up space in our pack. So we had to either discard some of our stuff or just carry the extra weight.
So what would you leave out? Or
We used to leave out all the tin food because that was heavy. Just take dry rations. We left out, they had blow-up mattresses for you sometimes, but they never worked very well anyhow. You'd puncture them and that was the end of them. So we left that out. That's about all we could leave out. We had a little bit less ammunition we used to carry, just to make us a bit lighter. And then in the platoon they used to spread the load around so that radio operators didn't carry any machine gun ammunition. They'd spread that to somebody else, so that they lightened the load for the individual by spreading it around in the platoon, so that everybody was about the same weight, which was a good idea.
Did you ever have R&R outside of Vietnam?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I came home on my R&R, which I think was a mistake. It brought me back to an ordinary world that was so removed from Vietnam that I couldn't believe that it still existed. Had I taken R&R over there, I would have gone to Hong Kong or Bangkok, which would have been more orientated to where we were. But a chap said, "Oh, you want to come home on the R&R and relax." But the first half was trying to relax, the second half was getting ready to go back. So it wasn't a real success. And I think it was hard on Mum and Dad to have me home for a week and then go back again. And when you got back there, you just didn't believe you were back. It wasn't a good idea.
So when you went back for your final 3 months, how nervous were you getting towards the end about the contacts you were having?
Oh, I probably was. I think we were all fairly heightened nervously. I don't think for the month back after I had my R&R, I don't think I believed I was there. I thought, I can't believe this. So that month probably went, no, just didn't even, in fairyland, I don't know. We were all getting fairly stressed about it, because you just knew every patrol and every day was a day closer, and they had to maintain the pressure. They were maintaining it on us to keep us alert, and we did operations and patrols just like if you weren't going home. But in the back of the mind, you knew you only had so many more days to go. So I think it put a lot of strain on us.
Were there particular contacts during that time that you remember in particular?
Oh yes, we had quite a few. On the second last day, we lost a lieutenant on a landmine. When we were actually coming out. We'd finished the patrol and we were coming back. In those 2 days, we had to walk out to a point to be picked up, and we were walking out. And this fellow's trod on a landmine. And I particularly remember that because the platoon commander said, "We're not going down that track there, we're going to go out here and stay in the jungle." Everybody complained about being in the thick of it, and the other platoon went down the track that we didn't go down, and the fellow stepped on a mine. So we probably were lucky that our platoon commander said, "We're going this way," and we didn't have the mine incident. But that was pretty disastrous, getting so close to coming home. And we were really on tenterhooks then, and we still knew that when we got back to Nui Dat, we'd still have to come out and do patrols anyhow. So the closer we got, the worse it got.
We were talking to a veteran from Long Tan, and he was saying, the battle at Long Tan had been so unexpected. Were there times when you were involved in contacts that could have ended up on that scale?
I think so. We ambushed half a dozen enemy one night, and then after we'd ambushed them, we thought, this is good, that's settled with. And then another half dozen appeared, and then another half dozen. And all of a sudden we're faced with as many out there as there was us. It was a full platoon, and there was really a firefight between the two platoons. And when we captured one of them in the morning, he said there was 150 of them just down the track a bit, and they decided that we were too big to attack, and they moved away. Had they not decided, we would have been in a lot of trouble, because we were only 28. They didn't know that. They thought we were a larger group, so they left us alone. But there was he said about 150 of them. So yes, that could have developed. There was that incident when that happened, and another incident when we actually almost surrounded a company of North Vietnamese, and they thought we were a bigger group again, and they went away. We attacked, but we didn't know how big they were, and so we were in the same position again, whereas they thought we were bigger, so they moved. And had that not happened in those two incidents, we could have had something similar. One night we had an ambush, and the fire orders were for so many rounds, fire for effect, and after you got to a certain number of rounds, you just called for continuous fire. And we called for continuous fire because the enemy just would not go away and wouldn't withdraw. And so that was another time. We don't know how big they were or anything about it, but we just had continuous fire, so the guns just kept firing without stopping. So there was a lot of artillery landed on their positions, and we don't know how big they were.
Were there particular tactics that you were using to trick the enemy into thinking there were more numbers?
No, not that I know of. It was just possibly the way we'd spread out. That it was a bigger area than they expected. I don't know. But that was all we got from this prisoner, was that there was. I'm assuming the other two times they just assumed we were bigger, or there might have been some other fact that we didn't know about. They might have had to be somewhere else. At a certain time, they couldn't be bothered to pull up and fight a battle here when they had to be somewhere else. But the first instance was when the interpreter, this Viet Cong, said there was 150 of them, and had they known we were smaller, they would have attacked. So that's the only incident I can faithfully state that there was more of them than us, and they didn't think there were so few of us. But mostly we were in platoon strength, which was 28 men. Sometimes we went down to half platoon strength towards the end in the last couple of months, and we were just 12-man ambushes. And some of them were a little bit scary because there was only 12 of you. And but we never ran into any big groups of North Vietnamese or Viet Cong.
Why was that it was half strength at the end?
I think they were just trying to cover a lot of ground with as few men as they could. And reinforcements weren't coming through then. Once we got into the last couple of months, they didn't send reinforcements to us, to the battalions. They just kept them for the next battalion. So anybody that was sick or wounded or what wasn't replaced. A bit like the public service. So we just got more under strength. I suppose it's logical to do that. But 12 men in the jungle, there's not many in a group.
Could you describe the trip home?
Oh, the trip home.
The day you left and what it felt like?
The day we left, we got up early, we had all our things packed, and we went down to Luscombe, and the Hercules was supposed to be there and to fly us to Saigon, and we're going home. It was unbelievable. And when we arrived at the Luscombe, the Americans had just invaded Cambodia, and every available aircraft was going to Cambodia, including our Hercules. So we stood around from daybreak till about 10 o'clock, waiting for the Hercules to come back. Finally, we got our Hercules, and we flew to Saigon, and we got on the plane and taxied to the end of the runway, and the air conditioning system broke down. And they said, we're going to be here for a couple of hours, maybe we have to stay overnight before it's fixed. And everybody went, ooh, you know. And we finally took off probably at, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. No, it might have been a bit earlier, might have been 2 or 3. And we flew out over the Delta, and the pilot said, we are now out of rifle range. Everybody went, hooray! And then we flew a bit further, and he said, now we're out of artillery range. And of course, another rousing cheer. And all the way home, he was giving us different points where, you know, he said, they can't even get you here with a jet fighter. Hooray! And when we came to Sydney, he said we might have to divert to Darwin and spend the night in Darwin if we're too late for the curfew in Sydney. Well, we were going to be too late for the curfew in Sydney because we actually landed about 2 o'clock in the morning in Sydney. And we all booed him for that. And about a beam of Darwin somewhere, he said, oh, we'll go to Sydney, stuff their curfew, and everybody go, hooray, because he knew he was going to go to Sydney anyhow. And when he said we're approaching Sydney Airport, we'll be landing in 20 minutes, everybody just sat there and didn't say a word. And I think that was very strange. We cheered everything up until then, and everybody just thought, we've made it, we're there, we're home. And we just all sat there and just thought, let's hope we can land this thing. You know, it was just a great relief, I think. You just couldn't believe that you'd got there. It was a great trip home. Yeah. Just unbelievable. I still feel it. I don't think that feeling will go away, because we just couldn't believe that we'd got there.
Were there farewells at Nui Dat for people who were going home?
Yeah, you lucky bastard, you're going home. Goodbye. No, there wasn't, because when we went, our replacements were on their way up, and we went early in the morning, and you didn't even meet the fellows you were replacing. They came in, they went that way, you came in, you went that way. There wasn't many goodbyes, no. There were a few if you had particular friends that were going home early because of their tour of duty had finished, you might have got to say goodbye to them, but they were usually ushered out a day or two before they were supposed to go. And they went and lived in a different tent, mainly so that they wouldn't upset the fellows that were still there, I think. So there wasn't a lot of goodbyes, no. They just disappeared. And you went on with what you were there for.
Who was there at Sydney Airport when you landed?
Unbeknownst to me, my mum and dad, but I didn't know they were going to be there. So I came out into a crowd and just looked around and couldn't see anybody because mum and dad were at the back, and I just went out to, I didn't know where I was going to go. I thought, well, I've got to stay somewhere, so I just rang up my girlfriend at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, hello, guess who? I'm back, I need somewhere to sleep for the night. And she said, she'd sort of, everything was cool. I just need somewhere to sleep. And she said, okay, come around. And then I walked back from the taxi back in and saw mum and dad. And of course, they were going to take me home to my auntie's place for the night. And so then I had to go out and ring up my girlfriend and say, sorry, I've got somewhere else to stay now. Sorry to wake up. So I went with mum and dad to my auntie's. And then the next day we came home. Oh, in the meantime, I'd gone around and bought a bunch of flowers and took her around for waking her up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then we went home. And that was my homecoming. It was just, an ordinary drive back to Cowra, and just the disbelief that I was just home.
I've spoken to World War II veterans and other Vietnam vets who came home by boat, and they said they had time to adjust in a way to that journey home. Was it difficult stepping off a plane with quite a short journey home and feeling that you were home and making that jump?
You knew you were home. The feeling, you're probably still switched on. You were still nervous and anxious and everything like that. I think it was just too quiet. You'd got used to the hurly-burly of things. There was always noise. There was gunfire in the distance, there were helicopters, there was machinery, there was whatever. It was always noisy. Even in the jungle, you got used to sleeping with gunfire around. And I think coming home was so quiet. That was probably one of the things. But I think you adjusted to being home fairly quickly in that respect. Just it was so quiet. But I think it was so quiet you went, there's got to be something wrong here. Why is it so quiet? And I just went back to, looking back, I know that I didn't just go back to farming. I was probably unsettled forever. I think we've found that with everybody now. You just were unsettled, not knowing exactly why.
What were those first few months like back on the farm?
I think I was just relieved. I was back. I really can't remember. We came into the club every Saturday night, and we did what my friends and relations had been doing for a year without me. Just went straight back into it. Although you were different to it, you did just what they did. I think I found a lot of people boring. Not just boring, but dead boring. I think I found a lot of people they just didn't know that they were alive. They'd complain about the water didn't come through their tap when they turned it on, and little things like that used to annoy me when they were complaining about things. I used to think to myself, you should complain. I probably still do think that way. I've been overseas a few times and since then, and I just come back each time and think, why does anybody complain in Australia? So that might be just me, not anything to do with Vietnam. But at the time, I thought, these people don't know they're alive. I often think we should send all young people overseas for at least a fortnight because of that. Makes you very appreciative of where you are and what's going on around you.
What did you feel when you saw things like the moratorium marches on TV? Or
Used to get cranky about it. I think we felt we were doing a worthwhile thing. Maybe not the fighting part of it, but what was going on behind the scenes, like I explained before, all the civil works and things that were going on. We saw that as good. We couldn't see that it was bad. I would probably feel the same still, although things have changed. Since Vietnam, I've learnt the history of Vietnam, which we didn't know then, and I look at it and say, they needn't have been involved if they'd done things differently, the powers that be. If the powers that be had done different things, that wouldn't have ever eventuated. But because they did what they did, it eventuated. So I still have to defend it. I have to defend it just for myself, so that I haven't wasted a year of my life. If nothing else, I've got to defend what we did, because I don't want it that time that was vital to me to be a waste of time. A lot of our effort was wasted. War's a wasteful thing. We just wasted things. We wasted material and everything. But I'd hate to say that my year in Vietnam was wasted, because then it just means that there's a year of your life that meant nothing. And it's the year that changed everything. I regret that sometimes, that it changed me, and it'd be terrible if that was a waste. I'd like to justify it as something successful. You know what I mean? If it was a waste, I think, well, I've paid for it in lots of different ways over my life. I've paid for that. And if it was wasted, a terrible price to pay. Maybe other veterans feel the same, I don't know.
In what way do you think you've personally paid for going to war, for going to Vietnam?
I look back on my first marriage, and I think of some of the things that happened, and I could never see that it was me or the way I reacted. I can now see that what I did was a bit extraordinary, or a bit, not stupid, but not ordinary. I thought it was usual, or I thought that was how you should react, or given a situation, that's how you would react. And looking back, I think, no, that was a funny way to react to something. Whether that put a strain on the relationship, I don't know. I think it did, although I was oblivious to that. I regret that. I think my children probably had some of my anxiety rub off on them. I think it puts you in a position where you've not very much matters. Trivial things don't matter. You don't let trivial things matter. So the important things that matter you get very intense about. And I think that would affect anybody around you. Whether you do it deliberately or not, it's going to... I think that's how I was. I don't think it's changed much. I think that's people treat you different, because I hate being labelled a Vietnam veteran. Not because I went to Vietnam, but it labels you with the whole spectrum of Vietnam veterans, from the worst to the best, and somewhere in there you fit. Mostly when you get a label, people will think of the worst example to put on you. I don't like that. I regret that that's in there somewhere. I sometimes wonder how my life would be without it, and whether I would have been happier. But that's something I can wonder about for the rest of my life. There's no answering that question. I just think sometimes there might have been opportunities that I would have gone different directions that would have made my life different. But for Vietnam, the die was cast then, and that the progress of my life has been relevant to some of that, which I get annoyed about, to think that could do that to me. I'm still here. Yeah. Yeah, I just wonder sometimes about it. But anyhow.
Do you feel there was enough support for the National Servicemen in particular who came back from Vietnam?
I I think there was a reasonable amount of support here in the country. I think there was enough Second World War veterans that came back without fanfare from the Second World War. The Second World War ended and they were in the islands and they just came home, not as conquering heroes, but just brought home by train and dropped off and said, thanks very much, but that's it. And I think there was enough of them to recognise that that's what happened to me, especially the fellow that sat on the plough. He was one of the first to come and say good day. And then I had another uncle that was in New Guinea, and he used to talk to me. And I think there was enough of them around to give you a feeling of camaraderie, and because there was no other fellows I knew. There was one chap 20 miles away. Well, he moved away. So there was none of our unit there. There was nobody there. There were a few Vietnam veterans around that you knew of. But it was the older generation fellows that gave me support. And I didn't feel out of it because of that. I think the fellows that were in the cities had a far worse time because nobody knew enough about them or cared about them or whatever. So I think the situation I came back to was better than a lot of other people. And I was accepted back by these fellows, and I just, because of what I said previous, I felt that I'd got to where they were, so I just felt at home with them. And I think that was very supportive at that time.
What did you feel when the decision was made to withdraw Australian troops from Vietnam?
I think I felt probably relieved but disappointed because we'd come so close to winning. It was like finishing a football match at half time. I thought all this effort and they're withdrawing. I think that was disappointing. Probably relieved that other blokes weren't going to go, but more disappointed. You know, just so close and yet so far.
If you had your time again, would you want to go on national service and go to Vietnam?
Probably. Because I don't know how my life would have gone, I probably want to stick with what I've done. Yes, I've probably in some ways, no, I've definitely wouldn't have gone, but as a broader thing, probably I've learnt more about my forebears and about myself. I think I'm at ease with myself because I know, without a doubt, where some of my emotions go to and come from, and how I'd react. Nobody has to say to me, have you ever been scared to death? Because I say, yes, I've been scared to death. I know what I would trade my soul for because of Vietnam. Whereas I don't think a lot of people do. It might be a funny thing, but I think I know inside, no matter what my exterior might say, but I know inside where I'm at. And I would never have got that feeling without Vietnam.
Frank, thank you very much for being involved in the archive project. It's been fantastic talking to you.